Hello wrestling fans. Welcome back to the $20 million Pro Wrestle Machine studio and welcome back to the show. Through the use of the Pro Wrestle Machine. December 15, 1997 Wrestling Observer Newsletter. Birth of Mr. McMahon and the Attitude Era. Owen Hart returns at In Your House, DX. Bret Hart Prodigy Chat. Shamrock Takata UFC fight almost happens. And more. By Observer staff. The never-ending saga of the Survivor Series finish has now become both the catalyst and focal point for both new angles and instances that aren't angles at all in the WWF, and perhaps even an angle in WCW. Among them, Vince McMahon's going from babyface television announcer to almost a dictatorial heel owner role as a television persona, stemming from such a strong negative backlash to him from the Hart-Michaels finish. Owen Hart's getting a huge raise to return to feud with Shawn Michaels, Jim Neidhart's leaving and the possible departure of Davey Boy Smith, McMahon threatening Bret Hart with a lawsuit, and yet another angle spoof where Steve Austin voluntarily gave up the Intercontinental title rather than wrestle, i.e. do a job for Rocky Maivia. McMahon showed up on yet another in the almost monthly New Look Monday Night Raws on December 8th, from Portland, Maine, an even more harder-edged, strange insider-type show designed to throw out constant shocks a la ECW, complete with Mark Marrow doing an interview before a match with Salvatore Sincere, calling Sincere a jobber and a jabroni and explaining those were terms used for a guy who was paid to lose, and saying that Sincere was just a silly marketing gimmick and that he was really Tom Brady. Shawn Michaels playing strip poker for about 30 minutes, including drinking Jack Daniels and smoking a cigar and finally getting down to his BVDs, and actually putting his hand on and shaking whatever it was that he had in there right in front of the camera, and pulling down his underwear and mooning the live crowd during a commercial break. Goldust flashing Vader and Sable, wearing ultra-high heels, taking off a potato sack to reveal as skimpy a swimsuit as possible. All in all, it was almost like the joke of I went to the fights and a hockey game broke out. In this case, I went to the variety show and they did some wrestling matches, as there was a total of 14 minutes of wrestling on the 2-hour show. McMahon, who was heavily booed coming out based on the response to his Why Bret Why interview, came out and began a heel turn in confronting Austin, making it clear he expected Austin to do as he said since he was his boss. McMahon, with the ring surrounded by agents a la the Hart scenario, claimed Austin endangered the lives of the fans by driving the truck, which they are giving away in a Royal Rumble marketing gimmick, into the arena, and claimed he used the truck as a weapon in his match. During the show they showed McMahon talked with agents, Gerald Briscoe in particular, trying to give the impression they were plotting to screw Austin out of the title since earlier in the show McMahon called Rocky Maivia the People's Champion. Then at the end, with McMahon in the ring and the ring once again surrounded by agents, Austin, in fantasy to foil the double cross, and in reality to avoid doing a job on television while getting the belt to Maivia, voluntarily handed the belt to Maivia. He then gave Maivia a stone-cold stunner after congratulating him on being the new champion, grabbed the belt and walked off and, actually using the term ratings ploy, said that next week on the show he'd show everyone what he was going to do with the belt. Before leaving, while bouncing off the ropes, he accidentally knocked into the ropes that McMahon, who was standing on the apron, was holding onto, resulting in McMahon taking a pratfall on the floor and getting up, just as the show was going off the air, spewing a string of expletives at Austin that were edited off the broadcast in the 7-second delay mode. The One Thing Getting Old is weekly opening the show promising a wrestling match with Austin as the headline event, or last week with Hart vs. Michaels, and always finding a way not to deliver it. The show basically held the same ratings level as the previous shows since Survivor Series, doing a 2.99 rating, 2.78 first hour, 3.20 seconds hour, and 4.59 share. Monday Nitro on December 8th, a lackluster show before a sellout crowd of 16,848, with 15,101 paying $251,698 in the Marine Midland Arena in Buffalo, New York, did a 4.24 rating and 6.42 share. It was the third largest gate in the history of WCW and largest ever for a Nitro, trailing only pay-per-view gates the past 2 months in Las Vegas and Auburn Hills, Michigan. The Nitro replay did a 1.70 rating and 3.18 share. Quarter hours told an interesting story as there was more switching back and forth than ever before. Nitro did huge unopposed, then took an unusually large drop from its 5.0 peak for Chris Benoit vs. Lodi to a 3.7 when Football and Raw began, despite having the star power of Ric Flair, who has delivered the strongest ratings boosts of any wrestler in the business thus far this season, and Randy Savage in the first quarter. Both shows stayed steady in the first opposed 60 minutes, with WCW having a 3.80 to 2.78 cumulative lead. Then at the 10 to 10:15 p.m. mark, WCW grew to a 4.6 while Raw fell to a 2.4, WCW having Scott Hall versus Diamond Dallas Page, and more likely the draw was that everyone knew they were doing a big Sting angle to close the show since it was teased twice earlier in the show. WWF had the strip poker game in mid-ring. It was more likely this big difference was a positive reaction to WCW than a negative reaction to the strip poker angle, because once WCW went off the air with a live show, the Raw audience grew nearly a point even though the strip poker angle was still going on. As noted many times, when WCW ends, Raw has often not grown at all, and usually only grows slightly, but this week it went up nearly a full point to a 3.3 and ended up peaking at a 3.7 for the teased but not delivered Austin vs. Maivia IC title match. This says that the WCW audience is remaining at a very strong level, and the WWF base audience really hasn't grown to a great degree in the past 5 weeks, but that the WCW audience is more curious than before in watching WWF as long as WCW isn't on the air opposing them. To counter this, expect WCW to go long on Nitros once again to keep from providing WWF with too much unopposed time once Nitro goes off the air. For December 1st, Nitro did a 3.80 rating, 3.90 first hour, 3.72 seconds hour, and 5.66 share to Raw's 3.01 rating, 2.75 first hour, 3.28 seconds hour, and 4.53 share, and the Nitro replay did a 1.70 rating and 3.08 share. Another new look of the show was yet another in the almost weekly change in the announcer's situation. McMahon has gone from his interviewer role to a television role as the heel owner of the company, seemingly replacing Sergeant Slaughter's commissioner role that looks to have been dropped since his character was too cartoonish for the more serious direction the company is going. The Jim Ross/Jim Cornette first hour announcing team became Ross along with Michael Cole and Kevin Kelly, with Cole and Kelly almost dominating the announcing to the point Ross was strangely quiet, to the point he could be compared with Bruno Sammartino's role in his last days with the company. However, Ross was as lively as usual in the second hour doing the announcing with Jerry Lawler. The situation with the remainder of the Hart Foundation was largely squared away during the week. McMahon, to soothe the hard feelings, offered Owen Hart a huge raise to return in a more prominent role as a singles headliner to work against Shawn Michaels. He offered Davey Boy Smith some form of a release opportunity after Smith came through arthroscopic knee surgery on December 4th. At the same time, Jim Neidhart, who wasn't under contract to the WWF, followed Bret as expected in making the move to WCW. This led to even more problems with McMahon and Bret Hart, with McMahon at one point personally and at another point lawyer to lawyer threatening to sue Bret Hart for tortious interference with contracted personnel because Bret had voiced his opinion to Owen that he thought it would be in bad taste to try and exploit the reality and trivialize it by making it a wrestling angle. Bret Hart had previously stated something, I believe on the TSN Off the Record show earlier in the week, to the effect of that he wondered if McMahon were to at this point give all his contracted wrestlers freedom to negotiate elsewhere, that how many on their own volition would choose to stay. McMahon and Hart, in their first discussion, described as not cordial in the least, since the Survivor Series, largely regarding the subject of Owen returning and doing the angle, saw Bret Hart say he should give Owen the opportunity to negotiate elsewhere, and McMahon said that he wouldn't, although the words on both sides may have been a lot stronger than that, and the conversation ended on a bad note with a lawsuit threat. Bret Hart had decided ahead of time not to bring up the subject of his last day in the WWF ever again after doing 3 interviews this week, a TSN Off the Record interview on December 3rd, a taped 10 minutes feature on Headline Sports in Canada which aired on December 8th, and a Prodigy Internet interview on December 7th. Although advised against it by lawyers due to the threats made by McMahon over the weekend, Hart blistered McMahon and the WWF for what went down in his final day with the company in the Prodigy interview. McMahon had this past week offered Smith some sort of an escape clause allowing him to negotiate elsewhere, and indications were that WCW would be seriously interested in him. There has been some thought given in the WWF to the idea of not wanting unhappy wrestlers around, and even if they are under contract, to give them the opportunity to leave. Of the two, it appeared there was more heat with Smith and the office over suspicions of the timing of his knee surgery, whereas Owen Hart was largely seen by everyone on both sides as being someone put in a bad position through things he had no control over. The belief is the McMahon/Bret conversation originally was agreed to for both sides to take pressure off Owen for being caught in the middle of wanting to do the right thing for making as much money for his company, doing the angle, and removing the stress on his family and letting the memory of what happened die out, not doing the angle. Smith's knee surgery turned out not to be as serious as some had feared. and he'd likely be able to return to wrestling within the next 2 months. Among the highlights of Hart's Prodigy interview were saying he thought Jim Neidhart made mistaken judgment in going along with the Angles in his final 2 weeks in the WWF, and said he thought the WWF humiliated Neidhart out of spite against him, which he claimed was a bad reflection more on the WWF than anyone else. He thanked Mick Foley for his show of defiance in missing the Ottawa show and said that he received calls from nearly every wrestler in the WWF with the exception of only a handful who felt the same way he did about the situation. He claimed that when he swore on TV before WrestleMania that he was misled by the referee and thought they were off the air. He said McMahon didn't set up the situation where he swore, that he explained to McMahon afterwards that he thought they were off the air and was never reprimanded by McMahon for it. McMahon had noted when Hart complained about the direction of the company that Hart had done things on his own that contradicted that viewpoint, and WWF officials had noted that the incident where Hart swore on the air got them more heat from the USA Network than anything they did in 1997. He called Dory Funk Jr. conceivably the greatest worker of all time. He claimed that Roddy Piper, Curt Hennig, Davey Boy Smith, Owen Hart, Shawn Michaels, Diesel, Razor Ramon, Yokozuna, Bam Bam Bigelow, Isaac Yankem and Hakushi among others all had the greatest matches of their career against him. He said his pick as his best match ever was the 1992 Wembley Stadium match against Smith. He claimed that Michaels was crying and weeping like a baby in the dressing room after the match and sat in the corner biting his nails. Michaels and Helmsley did get out of the dressing room in Montreal as quick as possible, both showing up at the hotel still in their wrestling outfits. Said that he knew he'd sound like a hypocrite now, but called Ric Flair one of the greatest performers in history. He said he's regretted for a long time some of the comments that he's made about him in the past, and said all he really ever meant is that Flair wasn't the greatest wrestler he ever worked with and that he may not have been in the top 5, but was in the top 20. He said he never met a wrestler, particularly at his age, who could wrestle the pace Flair could and has been wanting to apologize to him for a long time. On a radio show about 1 year ago, Hart did echo these same comments in regards to Flair, who Hart could empathize a lot more with once he turned 40 and was working nightly while banged up. I know that sounds like crap, but it's all true. Blamed his previous problems with Hulk Hogan on Vince McMahon putting thoughts and words into his head, and that after realizing the kind of person McMahon was, wanted to talk with Hogan to find out the real story of what happened when Hogan left the WWF in 1993. He said he would not attend a WWF Hall of Fame banquet if he were invited to be an inductee. He said he wasn't proud of his actions in the dressing room after the match hitting McMahon, although he thought he handled himself pretty coolly under the circumstances. On Earl Hebner, I know that people think that Earl Hebner was just doing his job. Maybe he was. But all he had to do was tell me that the day before as a friend and a man of his word. I told him if he was uncomfortable with me to just say so and that I wouldn't hold it against him, because I suspected something like this was being drawn up. He got tears in his eyes and told me he could never do something like that, and he swore on his children that he would never let it happen and he'd quit his job first. We talked for over a half hour and I left that room, the bathroom in Detroit, feeling in my heart that he was a close friend and no matter what pressure Vince McMahon put to bear on him, he would never be a part of or be involved in a conspiracy to tear down a guy with a reputation as good as mine. When I finally saw the match back, when I came home, nothing broke my heart more than seeing Earl Hebner sell me out without even any hesitation. It's one thing to get screwed over by my enemies. I already sensed who they were and what they had in mind. But it's a much more hurtful thing when you get screwed over by a very good friend. I hear Earl Hebner is drinking himself into oblivion, racked with guilt for the role he played, and all I can say is, have another drink on me, Earl. Keep biting your nails like your buddy Shawn and keep looking over your shoulder because sooner or later what goes around comes around. He claimed he wouldn't let his kids watch Raw ever since the McMahon interview with Melanie Pillman the day after Bryan's death. Compared the WWF having his brother Owen do an angle based on his final match in the WWF to a pimp forcing someone into prostitution. And if that wasn't strange enough, the world of NHB and traditional style pro wrestling again came closer together with a working agreement between the UFC and WWF that resulted in the announcement by the former of a Ken Shamrock vs Nobuhiko Takada match, the first NHB matchup between huge name pro wrestlers, on its December 21st pay-per-view show from the Yokohama Arena. And even stranger than the alliance between reality fighting and the historical masters of fiction is whether or not this match will actually take place. Shamrock, with the approval of the WWF, signed for the match on December 4th, and Semaphore Entertainment Group officially released it on its website the next day. However, this news was strangely never announced by the Japanese group that is running the local promotion for the show, nor did the WWF say anything about the match either on the December 7th pay-per-view show, in which Shamrock was in the main event, or its live Raw show the next night, despite an apparent agreement with Semaphore Entertainment Group to push the match. The word is that WWF is planning to tape a feature of Shamrock training for the Takada match and insert it into the December 15th Raw show, and use it to plug the UFC pay-per-view on December 21st, although by ignoring the match completely on December 7th and December 8th, it shows that the WWF is at best going to mention the match but not make a big deal of the match. The WWF will also have the rights to use the match after the fact on its television should it desire to do so. And the weirdest of all was at the Kingdom House show on December 8th. Reporters there talked with Takada, who once again claimed, as he has publicly in the past, that he is suffering from a variety of injuries and wouldn't even be able to start training until the new year, and claimed that he had never agreed nor would he be doing the UFC show. As of press time, the situation regarding whether that match will take place or if Shamrock will appear on the show, perhaps against another opponent, are unclear. The deal to get Shamrock to appear actually started several weeks back. Semaphore Entertainment Group made the WWF an offer believed to be in the $100,000 range for Shamrock to appear on the show, and WWF turned it down flat because they had major plans for Shamrock and didn't want to risk either his health or his reputation in an environment where they weren't in complete control. After that point, there were negotiations between Semaphore Entertainment Group and WWF to secure Leon White, Vader, for the show, being that Vader was a huge drawing card in Japan as a pro wrestler with New Japan and UWFI, a work-shoot group, and a lot of wrestling fans believe he's tougher due to his size than people who train specifically for real fighting. WWF may have considered White, but eventually turned down the proposal with the feeling that due to their own roster being depleted with injuries, they didn't want to risk White's health since he was in their plans as well. Although there were reports elsewhere putting the fact there were talks involving these two together and that their first match in Japan for FMW was booked in the manner it was specifically to build up a rematch, at no point was it ever considered having a shoot or a worked match with Shamrock vs. Vader on the UFC pay-per-view show. Also, it has been made clear that at no point was in Semaphore Entertainment Group interested in having any pro wrestlers, no matter how big their names, do the show in any kind of a worked situation. The talks largely were dormant until word came from Japan that Takada would only do the show if his opponent would be Shamrock. With ticket sales for the live event slow due to not having a big-name Japanese draw, it was felt imperative to get Takada to do the show. Semaphore Entertainment Group more than doubled the offer to the WWF for Shamrock at that point, at which point the WWF became very interested. It is believed the money offer is actually largely coming from Semaphore Entertainment Group's Japanese partners, a group headed by a Mr. Sakata with money backing from Tsuja Video, a blockbuster-like chain in Japan. After a few days of negotiating and the price changing upwards once again to where it would be by far the biggest payoff in the history of UFC, and among the biggest for a pro wrestler or NHB fighter for one match in history, Rickson Gracie reportedly earned more for his Tokyo Dome match with Takada. And it isn't in the range of Hogan's major pay-per-view payoffs. Shamrock signed the deal. The contract terms, it is believed, give Shamrock veto power over choice of a new opponent in the event of a late substitution. In the past, Shamrock had expressed interest in fighting either Vitor Belfort, who doesn't have a signed opponent at press time for the show, or Tank Abbott, who is scheduled at press time to appear in a tournament, but whether he'd want to do so with only 1 week of training is another question. From a business standpoint, if correctly promoted, Takada Shamrock should have a lot of curiosity and some box office impact in Japan, although with it going in cold, no storyline build-up, and not much time to get the pub out, not to mention no major office with weekly television to promote the match, it is by no means enough to guarantee a huge crowd at Yokohama Arena by itself. For the US, Takada's name means nothing and UFC has no television, so for it to mean anything from a business standpoint, it would have to be largely through whatever hype the WWF would give the match in hyping Shamrock, which at this point doesn't look like all that much if any. It is also interesting that Shamrock will be doing the show along with several people he's had a hand in training, his brother Frank, who faces Kevin Jackson in the under 200 title match, Maurice Smith, who faces Randy Couture in the heavyweight title match, and Teligman, who is an alternate in the heavyweight tournament. Why Takada, 35, whose only true shoot match was his one-sided loss to Rickson Gracie, although he's been victorious in double-cross situations with Koji Kiao and former heavyweight champion boxer Trevor Berbick, and was a world champion pro wrestler and a tremendous drawing card with UWFI before being one of the greatest workers in the world in the late 80s with New Japan, but working credentials mean nothing in the octagon, would insist on Shamrock raises several questions. It could be that since Shamrock, a former UFC heavyweight champion and the first King of Pancrase champion, who has an NHB record of 6-2-2, although both draws would have likely win-wins had there been judges, is already a major star in Japan with a tremendous shooter reputation, That Takada could risk a loss to him without devouring whatever is left of his falling reputation. It also could be that Takada feels it would be okay from a reputation standpoint, not to mention not as punishing, to lose to a mat submission expert as opposed to slugging it out with someone who would be more likely to deliver a knockout blow. Or it could be that Takada recognizes that Shamrock, 33, is on the road with the WWF in a very brutal road schedule, and that he can't possibly be in top fighting shape, and maybe he can catch him at less than his best and a victory would totally rehabilitate his reputation after the relatively easy Gracie win. But even with only 1 week of serious fighting training, Shamrock would be considered a heavy favorite in this situation, and of the reasons, the first would seem to have the most validity. The risk Shamrock is taking by going into this match is probably more of a risk of injury, as he's suffered numerous injuries in his fighting career, than a risk of losing. Takada's main weapon is that he can kick extremely hard, although he's not experienced in using that in legitimate competition and certainly not against a fighter with Shamrock's experience in mixed matches. Shamrock has fought and beaten both Maurice Smith and Boss Rudin in legitimate pancrase matches, and Don Nakia Nielsen, a former WKA World Cruiserweight Kickboxing Champion, in a mixed shoot match at a Tokyo Dome Pro Wrestling card, all of whom one would think kick as hard or in some cases quite a bit harder. While in pancrase Shamrock only lost one legitimate kick/submission rules match, he lost a kickboxing match to a trained kickboxer from the Netherlands, to Masakatsu Funaki, and that was largely to avoid any kind of an injury since the match was only a few days before the second Gracie match in UFC. His other loss, his pancrase championship loss to Minoru Suzuki, was a pancrase business decision before the first match with Dan Severn, in that pancrase didn't want to risk having their world champion lose to a world champion in the world of pro wrestling, even though Shamrock beat Severn in that match. Shamrock, after signing for the match, did a WWF house show in Providence, Rhode Island on December 6th, but only did about a 30-second squash match to avoid getting banged up. He followed it up working a hard 1829 on pay-per-view against Shawn Michaels in the main event of the pay-per-view, before flying to Dallas and missing the television tapings to begin training with Guy Mesger, Trey Teligman and Peter Williams for only about 1 week before leaving for Japan. But at press time, Takada's statements make everything questionable, which makes two major NHB main events that are unclear, as the rival KRS Promotions announced for its Pride 2 show on January 18th at the same Yokohama arena, a main event of Hoist Gracie vs. Mark Kerr. Kerr has a contract with Semaphore Entertainment Group which prohibits him from appearing in any televised fights. This show will be taped for television, and from doing any NHB shows 30 days before or after in Semaphore Entertainment Group show, and a court date is set for December 19th to determine whether Kerr has the legal right to do the show. A secondary question is whether or not a court in New York has legal jurisdiction over stopping a fight in Japan even though the contract was signed in New York. Nothing was officially announced as far as the rules of the fight, although that has been a sticking point. Obviously Gracie would want no time limit and no stand-ups for lack of action, and eliminating headbutts, which would theoretically be one of Kerr's most valuable lessons while on top caught in guard. Kerr wants as close to no rules as possible, i.e. headbutting legal, and since it will be fought in a ring rather than an octagon, netting under the bottom ropes so Gracie can't roll out of the ring. The Japanese promoters will likely insist of some sort of a time limit. Kerr may agree to the stipulations that if Gracie lasts the time limit, then rather than having judges, that Gracie be awarded the victory just for hanging on because of the expected 75-pound weight differential, and make wearing grappling gloves mandatory, but Gracie is against wearing gloves. Gracie also wants the referee to not have the power to stop the match. The first Pride 1 event, on October 9th at the Tokyo Dome, was the first pay-per-view event ever in Japan and drew an 8.0 buy rate, although with the limited universe that is actually 12,000 buys out of a universe of only 150,000 homes. Even so, it was considered a phenomenal success, even though the number of homes makes it likely not profitable, nor was profit ever considered any kind of realistic proposition from the pay-per-view at this stage of the game. The buy rate does show the potential in Japan for NHB, and even more so pro wrestling, when pay-per-view technology reaches the US level. Even with the Japanese debut of Hoist Gracie, the second event is not going to be put on pay-per-view. On paper, Gracie vs. Kerr looks to be among the most intriguing NHB fights in years, and also perhaps one of the most boring. Gracie, 11-0-1, who hasn't fought since going to a 36-minute draw with Shamrock in 1995 in a match that, had there been judges, he would have likely lost via decision. Kerr, a world-class amateur wrestler who weighed 255 pounds in his most recent UFC appearance, 7-0, has been victorious in 3 consecutive tournaments, 2 in UFC and another in Brazil, without ever being on the defensive. Kerr has won almost all of his matches in rapid order with the exception of a one-sided and brutal 30 minutes decision against Fabio Gurgel, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu expert with a similar style and considered to have similar level of abilities to Gracie. Unless Kerr makes a quick mistake, the match figures to go to the ground with Gracie hanging onto the guard. Gracie figures to take the most punishment, and if he can catch Kerr unaware in a submission, he can beat him, but if he can't, it's largely going to be the defensive posture and trying to avoid serious blows and wait out the time for Kerr to make a mistake since points aren't awarded for aggressiveness. Also announced for Pride 2 are Renzo Gracie, 4-0-2, versus karate expert Sanae Kikuta, Juan Mott Mars, 1-1, versus Akira Shoji, 1-1-2, best known for his 30-minute draw with Renzo Gracie at the Tokyo Dome. Branko Sikatic, the 42-year-old former K1 champion, versus Ralph White, another kickboxer in a rematch of their Tokyo Dome no contest match, and Marco Waz, 6-1-1, against TBA, who is rumored to be Brazilian Roberto Traven, 4-0. The WWF D-Generation X concept, as the top heel contingent, is of course almost a total knockoff on the WCW concept of the NWO. The trendy misspellings, the gestures designed to get heels over as cult babyfaces, the personalities, ironically key members of both groups, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall and Six in WCW and Shawn Michaels and Hunter Hearst Helmsley in WWF, were all members of the so-called clique that was riding high in WWF during Nash's reign as WWF champion, are all basically the same. In fact, there would be no D-Generation X heel group in WWF, as the company never would have gone in such a direction had WCW not been so successful taking the same direction, and now WWF is trying to take that direction one step farther. And so it was fitting that the WWF's pay-per-view named after its top heel contingent was about the same as WCW's in January, the infamous NWO Sold Out show. Really, the only difference between the shows is that the Sold Out show had better wrestling in the undercard, and the WWF show had a stronger main event in the ring, which sounds like a broken record since it's the same comparison every month between the pay-per-view shows of the two groups, and the WWF show did have better announcing. But that is hardly huge praise when one considers what it is being compared with. DX had a good, but not great opener, a good main event with a weak finish, a surprise appearance by Owen Hart which was only a matter of time before it happened, and one of the worst mid-cards in the history of pay-per-view, a collection of matches that each in their own way proved to be more unsatisfying than the one before it. The show on December 7th at the Springfield, Massachusetts Civic Center drew a sellout 6,358 fans, paying $112,864 with another $44,000 in merchandise. There was nothing on the show that came off as all that heated with the exception of Steve Austin's match with Rocky Maivia. And when the show was over, with the exception of the return of Hart, who will wind up doing an angle based on the double cross of his brother and feud with DX, and perhaps the strangest sight was of Jim Cornette doing the Mean Gene, Todd Pettingill, Doak role as the pre-show pitchmaster to hype last-minute buys. With Sunny on the shelf due to a broken foot, as has been reported she was stepped on by her horse, it was the Jackal who was with Kevin Kelly in the 900-line room. Not that WWF is alone in this or that WCW hasn't had more of a problem with it in recent years, but there were more physiques than at any time in the past 3 or 4 years with the telltale side effects, swollen nipples, crater-like acne of the back, and more muscular physiques associated with steroid use. And it's not just limited to the women. And the guy who wrecked his rental car wasn't even on the show. 1. Taka Michinoku, Takao Yoshida, pinned Brian Lawler, in 1202 to become the first WWF light heavyweight champion actually recognized by the WWF in the United States. There was a title of the same name recognized in Japan and Mexico from the early 80s until being dropped by New Japan as part of the deal to break up the J-Crown just a few weeks back. This was a good match and probably the best one on the card, although Christopher isn't really the best opponent for Michinoku due to the style clash of Southern style versus Lucha style. Michinoku used his springboard plancha and shot so high and far that he nearly overshot his target. Christopher missed a plancha and crashed face first on the guardrail, legitimately busting open his lip, which poured blood for the remainder of the match. He was wiping the blood on Michinoku. Michinoku did some other hot moves such as a swinging DDT, a Hurricane Rana and a second rope moonsault from the turnbuckle to the floor. Christopher came back with a dropkick off the top rope and 2 hard slaps to the face. After a German suplex and a power slam, Christopher went up for his Tennessee Jam, leg drop off the top, missed, and was nailed with the Michinoku driver for the pin. This sets up Michinoku returning to his namesake promotion for 2 shows on December 16th and December 18th as champion, the latter of which is headlined by himself in a singles match against FMW's junior heavyweight champion, Shuichi Funaki, who was his regular tag team partner before coming to WWF. They had an in-ring ceremony presenting Michinoku the belt while posing for photos for Japan with Tony Garea, Gerald Briscoe, and Pat Patterson. 3 stars. 2. Miguel Perez and Jesus Castillo and Jose Estrada Jr. of Los Boricuas beat Chains and Skull and 8-Ball, Brian and Ron and Don Harris, in 7:57. Crush was absent, still suffering from a neck injury. Savio Vega came out with Los Boricuas, but was ordered to the back. They did a little story in this match with Perez, who came off the top rope and began selling that his knee went out and rolled to the floor writhing in pain. At one point Vega came out and tried to replace him, but ref Tim White wouldn't allow him into the match. Castillo and Estrada looked really bad in this match. Finish saw Chains, whose work is 5 times better here than it was in ECW, but he's also 5 times less over, use a Death Valley driver on Estrada and have him pinned. Suddenly Perez arose from the dead, sprinted into the ring, showing everyone the knee injury was a work, delivering a somersault leg drop on Chains and put Estrada on top for the pin. Match wasn't much, but the finish was good. 1/4 of 1 star. 3. Butterbean, Eric Icksh, beat Mark Merrow via DQ in what was billed as a 4-round tough man contest for a low blow at 10 of round 4. It's almost hilarious in a sense, all the political red tape involved in the billing of this match. It couldn't be called a boxing match because boxing is regulated and theoretically thus can't be worked. It couldn't be called a boxing exhibition because Butterbean had a fight, if you could call it that, the previous night in Atlantic City on the Oscar de la Hoya pay-per-view, where Sable got to debut as a celebrity ring guard girl and hold up Butterbean's prestigious IBF World Super Heavyweight 4-round championship, as athletic commissions won't allow anyone to take 2 boxing matches, even if one is an exhibition, that close in time. So they had to call as a tough man contest. The problem with that is by not being under boxing regulations but instead tough man regulations, they had to wear these giant 18-ounce gloves rather than 12-ounce gloves that are easier to maneuver. With those giant gloves, both guys deserve credit for at least being in shape enough to where they didn't noticeably blow up, and if you've ever tried boxing with gloves that large, you'll realize that after 1 minute it's almost impossible to keep your arms up. That said, Bean looked terrible. In fact, it looked as though had it been a real boxing match that Merrow, who has real boxing experience as opposed to the gimmick stuff Bean does, would have taken him apart at will. Bean also looked to be about 5'8" or 5'9", as he was at least 2 inches shorter than Merrow. First round consisted of Merrow stalling to get heat and trying his best not to outbox Bean and show him up. After the bell, Merrow hit Bean from behind. In the second round, Merrow hit Bean with a flying knee and choked him with tape on the ropes and threw kidney punches. Merrow dropkicked him from behind after this round while Bean shoved down one of his cornermen. Third round was horrible, although Bean actually put some force behind the blow that Merrow had to sell as a knockdown at the end of the round, so the knockdown looked good. Bean threw the water bucket on Merrow to revive him to get up for round 4. That opened with another knockdown, and when Merrow got up, he threw the low blow for the DQ. Merrow then broke a gimmick stool on Bean, although it took him 2 tries before the stool would break. This match was meant to be the start of a major program, and not a one-shot deal. For being an outside celebrity gimmick, Bean really got no pop and the crowd wasn't into the match. Nevertheless, if the program goes as expected, there could be a method to the madness. Dud. Goldust and Luna did an interview where Goldust read from the Dr. Seuss book Green Eggs and Ham. He read in the most stereotypical gay lisping voice that he could. His waistline is becoming more reminiscent of his father's with every passing week. 4. Billy Gunn, Monty Sopp, and Jesse Jam, Brian James, retained the WWF tag titles, beating the Legion of Doom, Joe Laurinaitis and Michael Hegstrand, via DQ in 10:33. Gunn and Jam, who are due for an even bigger push in the future, got the belts at this point in time because LOD was taken off the books after this week for a relatively short hiatus. They stalled a lot before the match, claiming that Gunn was ill. He may very well have been, as he didn't tag in until the 6 minutes mark and looked terrible once he got in. Bad match with an even worse finish. Hawk sold most of the match and made the hot tag. They set up the Doomsday device, when Henry Godwin ran in and clocked Animal with a slop bucket. Hawk got the bucket and hit both Gunn and Jama and threatened the ref with it, who then DQ'd them. Dud. 5. Hunter Hearst Helmsley, Paul Levesque, beat Sergeant Slaughter, Robert Remus, in a boot camp match in 1739. This was the second straight pay-per-view with an excruciatingly long worst match of the year candidate. Remember, this one isn't eligible until the 1998 awards. Again, it wasn't through lack of effort, but this was every bit as bad as Sabu vs. Sandman. They didn't miss as many moves or have the total lack of psychology, but they booked this way too long. Because of Slaughter's physical condition, nobody took him seriously as the brutal old warhorse coming out of retirement to teach the young punk a lesson. The match was dead before it ever started, when Sarge did those outdated promos on Raw, and he got no pop coming out. For a match like this to work, the old babyface has to be really over so the fans overlook his physical limitations. Slaughter, who looked to be at least 40 pounds overweight and is the 49 years old that they billed him as, did try and took 3 really big bumps. But his movements were in slow motion, almost like watching a guy trying to do a pro wrestling match while in a swimming pool. Slaughter took a Harley race bump over the top to the floor. Actually, it could also be called a Slaughter bump, since in the early 80s when Sarge really was a great worker for his size, that bump was one of his trademark moves. Triple H clocked timekeeper Mark Eaton with the ring bell hard, and it appeared Eaton took the hardest shot of the night. Triple H used the wooden stand that held the bell on Sarge, and later Chyna gave him a chain which he used, including a Lawler fist drop with the chain for a near fall, but nobody cared. Sarge got the chain and made a comeback before taking a backdrop over the top rope. He also took a slam off the top rope. Triple H put Slaughter in a sleeper for an eternity. The hold didn't work on Sarge, but it did put 6,000 fans to sleep, along with more than 100,000 watching in the comfort of their own couches. Slaughter reversed it, getting the dreaded Cobra clutch. Chyna shoved down ref Jack Doan and broke up the hold. She got a chair and was about to hit Sarge, but Sarge threw powder in her eyes. Triple H then hit Sarge with his boot. Sarge came back and put the Cobra clutch on again, and this time Chyna, with her face all white, kicked Sarge low, and Triple H used the pedigree on the chair to score the pin. -2 stars. 6. Jeff Jarrett beat Undertaker Mark Calloway via DQ in 6:56. They basically did nothing except Jarrett clipping Taker and working the knee, all of which got no heat. Kane showed up with Uncle Paul. Jarrett told Kane to destroy Taker, so Kane choke slammed Jarrett, which enabled Jarrett to win via DQ. Kane, who with the lifts in his shoes was made out to be taller than Undertaker, slapped him in the face. Undertaker wouldn't hit him back, and Kane and Bearer left. Jarrett then jumped Undertaker, but got choke slammed again for his troubles. It was a one-arm variety, and Undertaker nearly lost him on the move. After Undertaker left, Jarrett got to strut in the ring. If you look up the phrase "not getting over" in your dictionary, they'll have a photo of Jarrett in that Mayan Indian outfit next to the phrase. Dud. 7. Steve Austin Steve Williams pinned Rocky Maivia, Dwayne Johnson, in 5:32 to retain the IC title. Austin came to the ring in his truck and got by far the best reaction of anyone on the show. The entire Nation of Domination attacked Austin, but he made his own comeback and backdropped D'Lo Brown over the top rope, and he broke the windshield in landing. Austin then gave him a stunner on the roof of the truck. Match had super heat. After a Thez press, Austin was destroying Maivia until taking a bump to the floor, where Farouk and Kama attacked him. Farouk went to hit Austin with a chair, but he moved and Kama took the blow. Austin whipped Kama into the truck. In the ring, Maivia used the dreaded overdone low blow on Austin but missed an elbow drop. After more distractions, Austin put the stunner on the ref, who he thought was Maivia. He then used the stunner on Maivia, and a second ref ran in to make the count. You can't expect Austin to have the kind of matches he had in the past due to his injuries, but given his limitations, this was pretty entertaining. 2 1/4 stars. 8. Ken Shamrock beat Shawn Michaels, Michael Hickenbottom, via DQ in 1829, so Michaels retained the WWF title. Michaels looks to have put on about 10 to 15 pounds in the past 2 weeks. He must be sleeping better. Michaels took his typical great bumps early. Shamrock looked robotic in spots, as if his accelerated preparation for his real fight was distracting him. Triple H and Chyna attacked Shamrock liberally. Michaels used a plancha onto the floor, and Triple H and Chyna continued to work on Shamrock as well. Michaels was puffy underneath his left eye from an apparent hard shot. Michaels used a lengthy sleeper. Shamrock made his big comeback with 2 hard clotheslines into the corner, a power slam for a near fall and a Hurricane Rana for a near fall. Michaels tried a crucifix into a sunset flip, but Shamrock reversed it into a near fall of his own. Triple H once again attacked Shamrock and threw him into the ring. Michaels hit an elbow off the top, but Shamrock kicked out. Shamrock came back using his belly to belly and put on the ankle lock, and Triple H and Chyna interfered for the DQ. Match was pretty good at times and just so-so at other times, and the finish for a pay-per-view main event was really weak. After the match, all three threw Shamrock over the top, and as Michaels was celebrating, Owen Hart ran in and knocked him off the apron, taking his monthly bump through the Spanish-language announcer's broadcast table. Hart jumped on him and was pounding away and ripping at the nose, apparently to draw blood to give the illusion that the punches themselves were real, before disappearing into the crowd. 3 stars. Toshiaki Kawada and Akira Tao captured All Japan's 21st annual Real World Tag League tournament for the second year in a row, beating Mitsuharu Misawa and Jun Akiyama before 15,500 fans. They announced a sellout 16,300 at Tokyo Budokan Hall on December 5. The match, said to be very good but not an excellent match, ended in 30-52 when Tao pinned Akiyama after a Liger bomb and a high kick to the face. The match story saw Misawa knocked out toward the finish, forcing Akiyama to face both almost by himself for the last several minutes. They played up a rib injury to Akiyama from the November 28 match in Sapporo between the two teams to get heat, and Akiyama came back with his exploder suplexes for near falls. Misawa tried to come back from the dead, only to be cut off by a Tao high kick and knocked out once again. The big crowd was drawn without any matches on the card being announced other than it would be the traditional tag team tournament finale, until the finish of an evening show on December 3 when it was clinched that Misawa and Akiyama would face Tao and Kawada in the finals. The championship match aired on the television show on December 7. Misawa and Akiyama beat Tamon Honda and Takao Omori on December 3 in Niigata to finish the round-robin tied with Kawada and Tao with a 7-1-1 record and 15 points. Kenta Kobashi and Johnny Ace, who beat Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki also on December 3 when Kobashi pinned Hayabusa, ended up tied with Steve Williams and Gary Albright for third place with both teams at 6-1-2 and 14 points. Johnny Smith and Wolf Hotfield, who got the surprise push of the tournament, ended up in 5th place with a 4-3-2 record and 10 points. Stan Hansen and Bobby Duncombe Jr. were 3 and 6 for 6th place, and the remaining teams Jun Izumida and Giant Kimala 2, Barry Windham and Justin Bradshaw, Hayabusa and Shinzaki and Honda and Omori all finished tied for 7th with 2 and 7 records. The appearance of the Blackjacks may have been the first step in opening up of a working relationship between WWF and All Japan, or may wind up being nothing more than an isolated incident. The plan right now is for the Blackjacks to return to All Japan for the February tour, and the WWF has also scheduled a meeting with Williams and Ace later this month, which would more likely be not to have them leave All Japan for WWF but for both groups to work together. At press time, nothing at all has been established other than Bruce Pritchard having sent Giant Baba a few faxes trying to open up dialogue. Baba, who is from the old school to the point that in his mind the power brokers in wrestling are names like Vince McMahon, Paul Bosch, Jim Crockett, Bob Geigel, etc., was actually unaware of exactly who Pritchard was and his current position in the industry. After the tag team tournament on the video wall at Budokan Hall, All Japan officially announced that it would be running a Tokyo Dome show sometime during the summer of 1998. The original date of the show was going to be April 5, but when word got out that New Japan was booking the same building on April 4, All Japan canceled the date. At press time they don't have a new date, although Baba isn't the type who makes a public announcement unless it's a totally locked-in deal. Because the Dome houses 2 Japanese baseball teams, there aren't any weekend dates available after early April until late August, and Baba, who is slow to take any kind of risks, is adamant about not doing the show unless it is on either a Saturday or a Sunday. When the idea of a Dome show has been discussed over the past year, there's always a Misawa vs. Kawada Triple Crown match considered as the main event as opposed to doing the interpromotional gimmick dream match such as, perhaps, Kawada vs. Ken Shamrock or Misawa vs. Vader that a WWF alliance would possibly enable. The Kawada and Tao win apparently is a continuation building to Kawada's attempt at big victory. Kawada has now won the last 3 major tournaments, 2 tag teams and 1 singles, and scored his first Budokan Hall singles match win ever over Misawa this year, although it was in the Triangle Finals of the Champion Carnival, and not scoring the clean win over Misawa to win the Triple Crown title. Keiji Muto and Masahiro Chono captured New Japan's Super Grade Tag League tournament, beating Shinya Hashimoto and Manabu Nakanishi in the finals on December 8 at the Osaka Furitsu Gym before a packed house of 6,500. In Muto's last major match before his IWGP Heavyweight title challenge against Kensuke Sasaki on January 4 at the Tokyo Dome, the advance for the show topped 40,000 tickets sold as of 2 weeks ago. He and Chono won the match when the referee stopped it at 23:33 when Muto had Hashimoto in the figure 4 leglock and Chono had Nakanishi in the STF simultaneously. The storyline was that Hashimoto and Nakanishi were tired because they had earlier in the show had to get by Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki in a playoff match with the winners to meet Muto and Chono, winning that match in 15:24 when Hashimoto made Yamazaki submit to the Wakigatami Fujiwara armbar. Muto and Chono finished the round robin in first place with a 6-1 record, while Sasaki and Yamazaki and Hashimoto and Nakanishi tied for second with 5-2 records. Tatsumi Fujinami and Kengo Kimura placed fourth with a 4-3 record. Hiroyoshi Tenzan and NWO Sting were fifth at 3-4. The teams of Satoshi Kojima and Tadao Yasuda at Voltage placed sixth at 2-5, while Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto, who were involved in a tour-long angle to set up their own group, finished last with an 0-7 record. Japanese television rundown. November 20th rings. 1. Gilbert Yvel beat Lev Barkala in 10:47. This was a shoot and it was the only one on the show. Yvel was a kickboxer from the Netherlands and Barkala was a wrestler from Russia. It was a sloppy match since Yvel was mostly scampering away whenever he got taken down, although there were good exchanges on their feet as Barkala had no fear of Yvel. This once again showed that a stand-up fighter, even with punches to the face eliminated, is favored more under these rules than UFC rules for two reasons. The smaller ring enables them to get near the ropes easier and avoid takedowns using the ropes for balance, and secondly, the rope breaks on submissions. Rings favors strikers more than Pancrase because you get so many more rope breaks before the match ends, as Yvel was behind in points 7 and 2 at the finish. Yvel used both to stay alive until finally knocking Barkala out with a series of knees to the chin. 2. Masayuki Naruse beat Mohamed Yone in 5:35 with a choke. Yone is Battler's fighter Satoshi Yoneyama using a new name. Naruse, who is far more experienced, was carrying Yone and it was obvious. Not a good match even though these are two Japanese wrestlers who should be experienced enough with worked shoots to do the style well. 3. Illukain Mikhail upset Tsuyoshi Kosaka in first quarterfinal match of the Battle Dimension 97 tournament in 14:11. This was a good ring style match, but not great. Kosaka looked good carrying things. Mikhail, who has done well in the past in UFC-type events, got a heel hook for a quick submission after being on the receiving end for the majority of the match. 4. Akira Maeda beat Mitsuya Nagai in 17 minutes. This was actually the best match on the card, all due to Nagai. Nagai, who is a competitive heavyweight kickboxer, dominated Maeda on their feet and really rocked him on several occasions before they'd go to the ground to allow Maeda to recover and control him. Maeda looked really bad, as in slow and out of shape, but in that way it made the match exciting because it looked like there would be an upset, and Maeda did allow himself to take a lot of punishment to get the match over. Of course Maeda blew up badly so the exciting spots on their feet weren't sustained and would be followed with resting on the mat. This was an angle match as well as Nagai continually worked on Maeda's bad left knee, which is as a shoot angle situation, something inside fans know is an unwritten rule in rings to stay away. So after the match, the two argued in the ring and Maeda slapped Nagai in the face, and they did a pull apart. 5. Folk Han beat Dick Frey in 7:15. Also a good match. Han got knocked down 3 times to make fans feel there might be an upset, the second straight match with the same storyline. The first 2 knockdowns really weren't much, but the third looked great as a Frey kick caught Han in the nose, and his nose swelled up big time. Han immediately finished with a choke after suffering the injury. 6. Kiyoshi Tamura beat Job Castell in 6:30. Castell, who looks like a huge bodybuilder, outweighed Tamura by 77 pounds, 266 to 189. Even more than the Hansa Nyman and Bitsaid Terriel matches, the size difference looked huge because Castell is a bodybuilder while the other two are simply big fat guys fighting a very small but muscular foe. It looked believable in that Tamura couldn't score a takedown on such a larger foe, but Castell didn't want to fight on the ground. However, they did nothing on their feet. Since it was mainly on their feet, it was a bad match until Tamura finished him with an ankle lock. Easily Tamura's worst match since joining the company last year to cap off a disappointing show. Puerto Rico. Don't have much in the way of news other than a correction in regard to the WCW vs WWF match on the Azteca Invasion Tour. Huracan Castillo Jesus in WWF did wrestle against La Parca, however the person in the La Parca outfit was not Adolfo Tapia, the WCW wrestler and Mexican star, but instead the wrestler who works for Promo Azteca as Super Parca, Ramo Banda. On the big show, Jerry Estrada worked with Lightning Kid, Steve Corino, which didn't get much heat. Pierroth Jr. worked with Invader #1 and Invader loved working with him since Pierroth can get so much heat from working the crowd and works an easy match, which since Invader and Carlos Colon are up in years and don't want to take any punishment, they love the guys who can get heat working easy matches. During the weekend, Villano 3 won the Puerto Rican title from Ricky Santana, but Santana captured the title back in a rematch. The tour was successful enough that they'll be bringing back Azteca wrestlers El Texano, Villano 3, Estrada and Pierroth from December 19th to December 21st and want them back for a 6-week tour early in the year. Mexico. AAA held a television taping on December 5th in Tijuana before 3,300 fans with a triple headliner as Perro Aguayo and Vampiro Canadiense and heavy metal beat Fuerza Guerrera and Sangre Chicana and the Killer Cibernetico won the Champion of Champions title beating Latin Lover via DQ and Perro Aguayo Jr. went to a no contest with Picudo. Reports were that Perro Sr. and Jr. and Mascara Sagrada Jr. were all super over and that the title change match was better than you'd think. Since it was in Tijuana, lots of the promo Azteca guys were there and a lot of people thought there would be legitimate problems between Dionisio Castellanos, the original Psicosis, and Leon Negro who is the Psicosis working AAA. The two were basically kept apart and there were no problems, and the commission wouldn't allow Negro to use the Psicosis name since the original is such a big star locally, so he was removed from the card. However, the commission did allow Antonio Pena to use a new Hysteria and a new Mosco originals both jumped to Azteca. Azteca is doing a huge show on December 19th in the same building. Vampiro is telling friends that he's quitting AAA for Azteca, his third jump in the last 4 months, and will turn heel in Azteca and team with Black Magic. Vampiro was promised $85,000 per year by Pena, basically that figure because that's what the Azteca wrestlers aside from Rey, Juventud, Conan, Psicosis and 1 or 2 others earn in WCW, but was shorted already on his paychecks and told they'd make it up to him later. The major lineups over the weekend saw December 5th at Arena Mexico the finals of the Copa Victoria with Blue Panther vs Atlantis plus a Triangle of Death match with Negro Casas and Felino, El Hijo del Santo and Black Warrior and Bestia Salvaje and Scorpio Jr., Mr. Niebla and Fantasma and La Fiera vs Dr. Wagner Jr. and Emilio Charles Jr. and Apollo Dantes and Brazo de Oro and Fray Tormenta and El Hijo del Solitario vs Violencia and Guerrero de la Muerte and Karloff Lagarde Jr. Azteca's big show was December 5th in Naucalpan with Conan and Hector Garza and Zorro and Tarzan Boy vs Jerry Estrada and Black Magic and Dandy and Silver King, Lismark Jr. and Super Astro and Super Colo and Mr. Aguila vs Juventud Guerrera and El Texano and Los Villanos 4 and 5, Oro Jr. and Shiryu and Super Muñeco vs Pantera del Ring and Mosco and Jurassico. AAA also had a TV taping scheduled for December 7th in Monterrey with Perro and Octagon and Perro Jr. vs Chicana and Picudo and Pentagon Killer vs Cibernetico in a chain match and Fuerza Guerrera and Mosco defend the national tag team titles against Mascara Sagrada and Mascara Sagrada Jr. To show how confusing this all is, the Mosco that won the tag titles with Fuerza now works for Azteca, and the Mascara Sagrada in this promotion is different from the more famous original one in Azteca. Azteca is now averaging running 17 house shows per week in Mexico, and building to a stipulation match on December 12th in Neza with Salsero and Torero vs Ultimo Guerrero and Ultimo Rebelde Double Hair vs Double Mask plus Mascara Sagrada defending the IWC title against Pirata Morgan. Arena Mexico has its year-end spectacular on December 12th. No word on what they are finishing with, although best bet looked to be a mask versus mask with Santo vs Scorpio Jr. All Japan. Aside from the tag tourney, not much in the way of major news. The next tour runs from half at Karakuan Hall ending on January 26th with the big show of the tour at Osaka Furitsu Gym and will have Steve Williams, Johnny Ace, Gary Albright, Giant Kimala 2, Wolf Hockfield, Johnny Smith, Ricky Santana, and the debut in All Japan of Skull Von Crush, Vito Lograsso who has been working Puerto Rico. Baba is looking at hiring Jinsei Shinzaki as a full-timer. November 23rd television show did a 3.9 rating. New Japan. Aside from the tag tourney, the major match this past week was the semifinal on December 8th in Osaka where Shinjiro Otani retained the IWGP Junior title pinning Kendo Kashin in 14-16 after a dragon suplex. At this point, there has been nothing said in Japan that would indicate that the Otani vs. Great Sasuke match at the Tokyo Dome is going to be changed, although from what we gather it is probable it'll be Ultimo Dragon in Sasuke's spot for the political reasons detailed here before. Keiji Muto is expected to come to the US, perhaps with the IWGP Heavyweight title after the Tokyo Dome show. He said that once he wins the title, he wants to have a title versus title match against Hulk Hogan or Sting in WCW. The working idea is for a Tokyo Dome show on April 4th, which would include a lot of the big stars from WCW. In the tournament matches during the week, on December 3rd in Himeji before a sellout 2000, Kensuke Sasaki and Kazuo Yamazaki beat High Dosage and Muto, and Chono beat Shinya Hashimoto and Manabu Nakanishi when Muto made Hashimoto submit to the figure 4. December 6th in Tokushima before a sellout 2200 saw Muto and Chono beat Tadao Yasuda and Satoshi Kojima. After the Tokyo Dome, the next tour will be 126 to 215, opening up with a show at Tokyo Oto Ward Gymnasium, and with shows on February 7th and 2/8 at Sapporo Nakajima Sports Center and 2/11 in Osaka Rinkai Sports Center before ending on February 15th at Budokan Hall. After splitting from the NWO after just a few weeks, Michiyoshi Ohara and Tatsutoshi Goto are forming their own independent alliance called the Freedom Dogs to feud with New Japan, Heisei Ishgun and NWO. Another idea kicked around for 1998 is to have Antonio Inoki appear on big shows in almost a heel manager role with his own NWO-like group, which would actually be a shooter gimmick group consisting of Satoru Sayama, Naoya Ogawa, Yoshiaki Fujiwara and perhaps even Nobuhiko Takada. After Ogawa's match with Don Frye, he's going to get rid of the judo gi and start wearing traditional wrestling trunks and boots. The feeling is that once he becomes a pro wrestler, that whatever drawing power he had from the Judo World Champion gimmick will be gone. November 22nd TV show did a 2.1 rating. Other Japan notes. There will be a multi-promotional show on December 23rd at Korakuen Hall with the proceeds to benefit former wrestler Umanosuke Ueda, whose career ended after a major auto accident after a 30-plus year career. The lineup will have El Samurai and Kendo Kashin versus Tatsuhito Takaiwa and Shinjiro Otani, New Japan, Hiroyoshi Tenzan and Hiro Saito versus Satoshi Kojima and Manabu Nakanishi, New Japan, Kendo Nagasaki and Yoshihiro Tajiri versus Ryushi Yamakawa and Great Nakamaki, Big Japan, Satoru Asako versus Kentaro Shiga, All Japan, Great Kabuki versus Daiko Kubo Benkei, IWA, Daisuke Ikeda versus Naohiro Hoshikawa, Battlers versus Michinoku, Goro Tsurumi vs. Devil, Tsurumi's IWA, plus matches to be announced from War, Samurai Project, Ryuma Go's Group, and Kingdom. Added to the Rings show on December 23rd in Fukuoka will be what would be believed to be shoot matches with Ricardo Moraes, 7-0-1 in NHV, versus Grom Zaza, a former Russian Olympic wrestler who has been working rings for a few years, and Sean Alvarez, who beat Yoji Anjo in NHB and lost to Oleg Toktarov, versus Willie Peters, a rings veteran with a 3-1 NHB record including winning a brutal tournament in Holland and losing a singles match in a matter of seconds to Tom Erickson at Mars last year. IWA is currently on tour with Pit Bulls, Leatherface, Doug Gilbert and Freddy Krueger as the foreigners. Gilbert works the shows twice each night, once in a prelim role as his own identity, and later in the main events as Krueger under the gimmick. The big show was December 9th at Korakuen Hall with Gilbert and Keisuke Yamada versus Pit Bulls in a bunkhouse match on top. The Kingdom show on December 14th won't be on pay-per-view, but will instead be offered free on DirecTV of Japan. DirecTV is just starting this month and they are offering major programs as incentives to get people to buy their service. Tank Abbott is going to be at the show, perhaps doing an angle of sorts for UFC, or knowing Abbott doing something turns into an angle without him knowing what an angle is. Abbott will be in the corner of Paul Herrera for his match with Kazushi Sakuraba. The Kingdom show will also be airing on Channel 8 in Tokyo at 1:45 a.m. later that evening with Nobuhiko Takada as the commentator. Alan Goes will be going to Kingdom for a match in a few weeks against Hiromitsu Kanehara, which would be a shoot match. Kingdom ran 2 shows during the week on December 2nd in Hakata and December 8th in Kagoshima with Sakuraba versus Kanehara on top with the 2 splitting matches. Yoji Anjo, preparing for the UFC, was given a win over Kenichi Yamamoto on December 2nd and a 37 seconds win over Masao Orihara on December 8th. Here is what has been announced for the FMW Tour from December 19th to December 22nd with the ECW wrestlers. December 19th at Tokyo Komazawa Olympic Gym has Masato Tanaka versus Atsushi Onita and Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki versus Mr. Ganasuke and Yukihiro Kanemura. December 20th at Osaka Rinkai Sports Center has World 6-Man Street Fight titles with Onita and Tetsuhiro Kuroda and Haido defending against Hayabusa and Shinzaki and Hisakatsu Oya, plus the Gladiator and Ganasuke and Kanemura versus Terry Funk and Sandman and Tommy Dreamer. December 21st at Nagoya Aichi Gym has the Zen vs ECW 10-Man with Onita and Gladiator and Kuroda and Haido and Hideki Hasaka versus Funk and Sandman and Dreamer and Dudleys and Tanaka defending the Independent World Heavyweight and World Brass Knucks titles against Kanemura. Tanaka had retained the title beating Kuroda on December 15 at Korakuen Hall. Final show of the tour is December 22 at Korakuen Hall with a War Games with Hayabusa and Shinzaki and Tanaka vs Onita and Ganasuke and Kanemura, plus a three-way dance with Gladiator and Haido, Funk and Dreamer and Dudley's. I believe FMW offered ECW a package deal for the entire crew for the 4 days for $30,000. I'm virtually certain that package doesn't include Funk, who earns something like $15,000 per week in Japan. Normally Onita won't pay a top foreigner unless it is Funk more than $1,500 or $2,000 per week. There is talk of doing an angle where Kanemura and Ganasuke leave Zen to feud with both the FMW and Zen. It is amazing that the success of the NWO gimmick in WCW has caused copying all over the world in nearly every major traditional promotion except in Mexico, where the idea has been floated around for months but just hasn't gotten off the boards, and All Japan, which doesn't do angles. Nitro will start weekly on February 8 on the Samurai Network. New Japan is upset at the Kyoko Inoue new group calling itself New Japan Women, so the Inoue group is likely going to be referred to publicly to avoid a confusion as far as being linked together as Neo Ladies Wrestling. Hiroshi Ogawa and Asia Kong's promotion got some press for trying to recruit 16-year-old Fumiko Hamada, the daughter of Gran Hamada, who is currently a junior high school student and recently won a major karate tournament. Her older sister Shochito Hamada has wrestled for many years in Japan and Mexico. Mayumi Ozaki announced that she was going to graduate, that was the term she used, from JWP as its December 6th show at Yokohama Bunka Gym. She did a 1 vs 3 match against Gia Sugar Sato and Chikeo Nagashima and her protege, Rieko Amano, putting Amano over. Ozaki didn't say she was retiring from wrestling, but that she was going to become a free agent, so this may simply be an angle. The show featured 2 JWP vs LLPW matches, as Hikari Fukuoka retained the JWP title pinning Yasha Kurenai, and JWP's Dynamite Kansai and Kanako Motoya beat LLPW's Shinobu Kondori and Mizuki Endo. LLPW ran a big show in Kawasaki using wrestlers from both AJW, JD and JWP. In the main event, which was a mixed promotional match, Kondori and Rumi Kazama of LLPW teamed with Ozaki to beat Kansai, and Cuddy Suzuki of JWP who teamed with LLPW's Harley Saito. Linus Asuka of JD pinned Norio Tadano in a battle of wrestlers who were superstars 10 years back as half of the Crush Gals and Jumping Bomb Angels tag teams, while AJW's Takako Inoue put over Eagle Sawai and AJW's Manami Toyota and Nani Takahashi beat LLPW's Michiko Nagashima and Sori Okino. The Michinoku Pro Tour of the major cities isn't really drawing well. There was a huge story in Taipei, Taiwan involving perhaps the most publicized crime in the history of the island, a murder of Pai Hasao Yen, the 17-year-old daughter of Iki Kajiwara. Kajiwara is the creator of the Japanese Tiger Mask cartoon and comic book character and worked with Hisashi Shinma in creating the original Tiger Mask wrestling character for Satoru Sayama, which basically put the junior heavyweight division on the map to stay in Japan. Kajiwara still has an annual major pro wrestling card in Japan named after him where Sayama usually headlines. Xiao Yen, whose mother was a famous TV actress, was kidnapped on her way to school in April and held on $5 million ransom. The ransom note to Kajiwara contained one of Xiao Yen's fingers that was cut off her hand to show that they were the real kidnappers. Kajiwara went to pay the ransom, but that fell apart when the kidnappers found out he had also contacted the police and she was killed. The crime, and the fact the police couldn't keep it under cover that they knew, screwing up the returning of her, shocked the citizens of Taipei to the point that there were protests in the street and forced the resignation of both Taiwan's Minister of the Interior and the country's National Chief of Police. The police had been after the 3 suspects in the largest manhunt in the history of the island of Taiwan for months. In August, after a gun battle in downtown Taipei where all 3 were pinned down, 1 died and the other 2 escaped. The 2 who survived later became suspects in a triple homicide involving a plastic surgeon, his wife and a nurse. Cao Tianming, a second suspect, was stopped at a police checkpoint but managed to shoot himself free from apprehension. On November 17, he was found again, and involved in a gunfight with hundreds of Taiwan police officers and was shot and killed. The third suspect, Chen Qinxing, remains at large. There will be a retirement ceremony on the 111 JD show for Bison Kimura. She was going to retire in September, but then she broke her arm, so she decided not to come back from the injury. Here and there. A few more notes on the famed English wrestler Big Daddy, who passed away on December 2nd. According to the London Times, Crabtree was actually born on November 14, 1930, which meant his age at death was 67 and not 60 as was reported here last week. According to the story, the Crabtree family grew up in poverty and Big Daddy in his youth was a huge weightlifter type who was once listed in the Guinness Book of World Records for having a 64-inch muscular chest. For those who remember him as a Haystacks Calhoun type fat man who was the most famous, but certainly not the best wrestler in England during a boom period on network television, the fact he began his career using such names as the Blonde Adonis and Mr. Universe and later the Battling Guardsman would seem strange. The article claimed he adopted the name Big Daddy, where he gained his fame, in 1976, famous enough that ITV, the network that carried wrestling every Saturday afternoon at 4 p.m., also at one point had a variety show called the Big Daddy Saturday Show. Due to lack of modernization, using fat older wrestlers, Daddy and Giant Haystacks in particular as the big draws, wrestling popularity in England fell during the mid-80s and ITV cancelled the show in 1988. At his peak, the ITV weekly audience for pro wrestling in England was said to be 20 million viewers, which is an incredible number considering what the population of the UK is. For comparisons, in October in the UK, Nitro averaged 158,000 viewers per week and Raw averaged 183,000, and the combined audience of Raw and Nitro together each week in the United States, a much larger country population-wise than the UK, would be less than 7 million total viewers, which is about what the joint promotions, Max Crabtree's company of which his brother was the top star, wrestling still was viewed by when it was finally cancelled in 1988, which made way for the WWF invasion. XL Sports, the group headed by Mark Selker that purchased 55% of the stock in the now-defunct USWA, officially filed for bankruptcy after dropping its lawsuit against Larry Burton and Jerry Lawler. The dropping of the lawsuit also means that Lawler can work for the various indies in the area, and Mike Samples announced that Lawler and Brian Christopher would be returning to Louisville for Kentuckiana Championship Wrestling. KCW is warring with Ian Rotten's IWA for the Louisville market. On December 2nd, the IWA drew about 150 and KCW about 135. KCW's main event was supposed to be Sabu vs. Flash Flanagan, however Flanagan no-showed and instead worked the date for Rotten, and Sabu instead worked with a wrestler billed as Babu. Also at the KCW show, Samples said that there would be ECW wrestlers heading in. ECW wrestlers Axel Rotten and Tracy Smothers have worked from time to time for Rotten's group, which also uses Stephen Dunn and Wolfie D along with Rotten's regular crew. Otto One's traditional biggest show of the year in December takes place on December 20th in Bremen, Germany called Mega Wrestling Night. The only word we have on the show is that they'll be bringing in Masahiro Chono, Doug Gilbert, S-Train, Savio Vega and Wayne Clearman, Crusher Klein from Ohio Indies, along with the top area regulars like Jean-Pierre Lafitte, Carl Ouellette, Robbie Brookside, Osamu Nishimura and heavyweight champion Marshall Duke Dries. Golden Boy Shane, who is working in Puerto Rico, came in for the November 30th Bremen show and lost while challenging Franz Schumann for his CWA middleweight title. The next all-pro wrestling show at the Pacific Coast Sports Gym in Hayward, California will be on December 20th with a one-night tournament to earn a title shot on the 1/3 show against Michael Modest and a Holiday Weapons tag team match in which each team will be allowed one bag of toys to bring to the ring to be used as weapons in the match. According to the Woburn, MMA advocate Tim McNeely, an area indie wrestler who sometimes does jobs on WWF television, had a complaint filed against him over an alleged attack at a party on November 1st. According to the complaint, Thomas Holmes, 26, claimed the 24-year-old McNeely attacked him. McNeely denied he attacked him and said Holmes showed up uninvited and allegedly caused a ruckus in filing his own complaint against him. When the police arrived at the party at 12:48 a.m., they found Holmes bleeding in the street. He was uncooperative with officers but later told police he went to the party and was having a few drinks and confronted by McNeely and a few others whom he couldn't identify. He claimed McNeely put him in a headlock and the others grabbed his legs and they took him outside and hit him with an unknown euphemism for foreign object. Holmes needed 22 staples in his head and stitches in his lip for repairs. McNeely claimed Holmes was disruptive at the party and was taken outside. He claimed Holmes swung at him so he grabbed him in a headlock and they fell to the ground, and Holmes split his head open upon the landing. Other witnesses said Holmes allegedly had caused a problem at a prior party at the same house. NHB. The announcing team for UFC will be Mike Goldberg on play-by-play, of whom we know nothing about, and Jeff Blatnick. Bruce Beck, who has hosted every UFC since the early days, won't be able to do this show and is questionable for the future because it conflicts with his duties as the weekend anchor for WNBC in New York. Kevin Jackson has reportedly suffered a hand injury, of which we don't have details about, but will be fine for his match on the December 21st pay-per-view against Frank Shamrock. At press time, the three names being considered to oppose Belfort on the pay-per-view were Hugo Duarte, Tsuyoshi Kosaka, and Semi Schult. The latter appeared to be most likely. Schult, from the Netherlands, is about 6'10" but gangly like an NBA center, is a pancrase fighter who won a major karate tournament, the Hokuto Flag Tournament, in Japan earlier this year. The downside to him is that although he's huge and has tremendous reach, he doesn't look physically menacing at all, but because of his height and reach, makes an awkward opponent for a striker like Belfort, since Belfort has surely never sparred with anyone of that size before. He is primarily a striker and has some decent ground skill. The Russian tournament, originally scheduled for November 29th and November 30th, was moved to December 13th and December 14th, which includes U.S. fighters Paul Verhoeven, Mike Van Arsdale, and Todd Butler. UFC is doing another 7-hour-long taped Ultimate New Year's Eve pay-per-view show showing highlights of cards dating back to 1993. ECW preliminary estimates on the buy rate for the November to Remember pay-per-view were between a 0.19 and 0.20, or about 45,000 buys, with a larger universe which would be about a $400,000 company gross. The buy rate basically held from the second show, with the number of buys increasing because of the larger universe, after a small drop from the first show to the second show. ECW has basically established its level on pay-per-view as a regular 0.2 deal, which is enough to be profitable provided they don't have a shrinking universe problem a la UFC. There had been stories within the industry about ECW needing to establish its level at 0.3, or some companies would feel it wasn't worth its while because of how many wrestling pay-per-view shows are already being offered, so that could also be a roadblock in 1998. Left to its own devices from a purely economic situation, the company should be able to run profitable pay-per-view shows, although nowhere near at the level of being competition for WWF, WCW, or even UFC, although its profit margin is certainly higher than UFC because the cost of doing a show is so much lower. The major weekend story was more injuries and 2 changes of the tag team titles. The belts changed hands first on December 5th in Waltham, Massachusetts, with Doug Furnas and Phil LaFawn beating the FBI, Tracy Smothers and Little Guido, and the next night at the ECW Arena, in a triangle match, Chris Candido and Lance Storm captured the belts. The Waltham match was scheduled for the FBI to defend against New Jack and John Kronus. However, Kronus was legitimately injured on December 4th in Revere, Massachusetts, and couldn't wrestle. To explain the situation, the Dudleys attacked New Jack and left them laying. Then Stevie Richards came out and gave a big plus for the WWF DX pay-per-view the next day and said that Vince McMahon and he had gotten together to bring a team to take the title and brought out Furnas and LaFawn. They basically worked the match with the FBI as the babyfaces, doing an ECW versus WWF storyline. Smothers blew his nose on a WWF banner. The match went 11:36 and ended with Furnas hitting Smothers with Tommy Rich's Italian flag and LaFawn pinning him. The three-way dance the next night, which was said to have been the best match on the show, saw Furnas and LaFawn eliminated first when Furnas had Mahoney up for a slam, but Rotten dropkicked Mahoney's back off the top and he collapsed onto Furnas for the pin. Lance Wright, who is actually from Stamford, Connecticut and of course was working as a house ring announcer for WWF before being laid off, was managing Furnas and LaFawn at the arena. This left Candido and Storm versus Axel and Balls, ending with a double superplex on Balls and a pin. In Waltham, as part of the deal since they were getting the belts, Candido and Storm put over Mikey Whipwreck and Spike Dudley in the opener, with Whipwreck pinning Candido clean. The Kronus injury took place when he and Bubba Ray Dudley were brawling in the back and Kronus fell through a door that he thought was closed and wasn't ready for it not holding. He cut his right hand badly, needing 15 stitches, and suffered a few broken knuckles in his left hand, including a dislocated little finger, and is expected out of action for a few weeks. Sabu was injured in Waltham, Massachusetts during the main event with he and Rob Van Dam versus Tommy Dreamer and Sandman. He tried to do a triple jump moonsault, but wound up landing mouth first on the leg of a table. People who were there live say it was the sickest looking injury in the history of the company, even though he actually didn't even miss one night of work over it. Sabu flew, landing too far to the side, and the table leg stayed up and his mouth went right into the table leg and was ripped open, and he was spitting out pieces of several teeth. He went to the back for a minute, but then returned, getting a huge ovation even though he's a heel, as fans realized he could have been seriously hurt and coming back. Paul Heyman and Bill Alfonso told him to go to the hospital after the show, but Sabu refused and instead superglued his mouth together and taped it up to look like Hannibal Lecter, and actually wrestled next night with his mouth all taped up. Shane Douglas will be out of action for about 1 month following elbow surgery. Bam Bam Bigelow was also out of action this weekend, with them attributing it to injuries suffered in the November 30th match to his kidneys, which is a worked storyline, although nothing was done dramatic enough in the match to warrant a serious injury considering what everyone else did on the undercard. Sandman did work all the weekend shots. There will be no domestic shows in 2 weeks as the top guys are going to FMW as a package deal through Heyman. Sabu will be going on the tour along with Tommy Dreamer, Sandman Dudleys, Heyman, and Terry Funk. In ECW matches, on December 20th in Osaka it'll be the Gladiator, Mike Awesome aka Mike Alfonso, and Mr. Ganasuke and Yukihiro Kanemura versus Sandman and Dreamer and Funk. December 21st in Nagoya will be a Zen, Atsushi Bret Hart Onita and the Gladiator and Haido and Hideki Hasaka and Tetsuhiro Kuroda versus ECW Dudleys and Funk and Sandman and Dreamer. While this hasn't been announced, Heyman is pretty much demanding a Sabu versus Sandman match for the December 22nd Korakuen Hall show, which he'll tape for that week's television show, plus a three-way dance. Planned for the three-way dance are Funk and Dreamer, Dudleys and Gladiator and Haido, although Heyman wants to get the latter changed to Gedo and Jado. Onita is opening up the business relationship with ECW after the WWF relationship seemed to fall apart, because he still has a personal goal of introducing the explosive barbed wire match to the United States and figures he could do it in 1998 on an ECW pay-per-view show. Weekend crowd saw Revere at about 700. Well down from the usual, although they usually run Saturdays and this was a Thursday. Waltham was about 850, or pretty well packed, and the ECW arena was estimated at about 1,600, and was said to have been the largest crowd ever in the building. There was no card even announced for the ECW arena show except mentioned in the day or two before the card of a couple of the prelim matches. In Waltham, in the Sabu and Van Dam versus Dreamer and Sandman match, the stip was if Sabu and Van Dam won, then Bill Alfonso would get 5 minutes with Beulah. They did win, however Beulah pinned Alfonso after a DDT in 2:38. Despite the pay-per-view name for 3-1 being the Night of Living Dangerously, that has nothing to do with Paul Heyman coming back as a manager. At the ECW arena show, Jerry Lynn and Tommy Rogers beat the FBI, and Rogers used his Tomikes on Rich, Smothers, and Guido. Whipwreck pinned Just Incredible once again using a Hurricane Rana, and also delivered a whippersnapper, Stone Cold Stunner off the ropes, onto Jason. Al Snow pinned Paul Diamond using the Akira Hokuto Northern Lights bomb finisher. The Head dressed up like Snow is really getting over, with heels attempting to steal the Head and fans chanting "Give me Head." Storm and Condito won the tag titles in the three-way. Cronus got on the house mic to talk about his injury, but he was attacked by the Dudleys. This brought out New Jack for the save, but he was also attacked until Spike Dudley made the save. New Jack and Spike are apparently going to be pushed as a new tag team, although they lost this match and both were helped out afterwards. Stevie Richards returned as Superstar Stevie Richards, coming out to Jesus Christ, Superstar similar to Billy Graham and later Steve Austin in his brief run in this promotion, wearing a big star on his trunks a la Bill Dundee when he used the Superstar name for about 1,000 years. Richards didn't get over it all and looked bad in his win over Chris Chetty. Finally, Sabu and Van Dam beat Dreamer and Sandman in the main event. Sandman was laid out during the match and replaced by Taz, and somehow Hill ref Jeff Jones caused Dreamer and Taz to lose, and the show ended with one of those everyone in the ring brawling finishes. We had mixed reports on the show. The heat was said to have been better than in recent shows, but reports we had is that the three-way was the only good match and that every show is starting to come across as being the same. There were a lot of complaints in Revere because there wasn't much blood on the show, and it's probably the most bloodthirsty crowd in any city they work, and also because neither Douglas nor Bigelow appeared and there weren't announcements made before the show of that fact, although I'm not certain their names were specifically ever advertised as being there either. WCW. In regard to last week's lead story, there has been a lot of talk within WCW as to the 1998 plans, and as best I can tell at press time nothing is etched in stone. If Larry Zbyszko wins, then it'll be WCW on Monday and NWO on Thursday, and if Eric Bischoff wins, it'll be the opposite. If Zbyszko wins, he gets a match with Scott Hall on Sold Out, but they're going to have that match regardless of who wins. As far as the Starrcade lineup, it'll be a 9-match show with Hogan versus Sting for the title, Ric Flair versus Kurt Hennig for the US title in a cage match, The Giant versus Kevin Nash, Lex Luger versus Marcus Bagwell likely to set up the angle with Luger versus Randy Savage, Eddie Guerrero versus Dean Malenko for the Cruiserweight title, not a triangle match involving Rey Mysterio Jr. as well as had been considered, Steve McMichael versus Bill Goldberg, and 2 other matches. The other two bouts will either be Steiners vs Harlem Heat for the tag titles or Steiners and Ray Traylor vs Conan and Scott Norton and maybe Savage or Hall, the former being the more likely, and Chris Benoit against either Raven or Perry Saturn. As you can see, there is far less emphasis on having good undercard matches as there was earlier in the year, and any consideration to using the Mexicans because they provide good pay-per-view matches has been dropped. Consideration is also being given to Bret Hart appearing on television as early as December 15th. Masahiro Chono will appear on the December 15th Nitro. Notes from the Nitro in Buffalo, which set the city's all-time record gate. The show was pretty much a nothing show overall. Juventud Guerrera beat Johnny Swinger in the only non-televised match. Ray Traylor pinned Conan in 5:37 when the lights went out, and when they went on, Conan was knocked out, apparently being an appearance from Sting. Steve McMichael pinned Barbarian with the Tombstone Piledriver in 4:08 in a horrible match. Dean Malenko beat Prince Iaukea in 3:51 with a cloverleaf in a well-wrestled match that was devoid of heat. Because there has become so little emphasis once again on the wrestling itself, guys like Malenko who aren't given interview time are losing steam in a hurry. Eddie Guerrero did commentary during this match and for the second week in a row did nothing to show the company is making a mistake by not giving him more interview time. Kevin Nash did a funny interview challenging Giant, and Giant did a lame interview accepting the challenge. Chris Benoit beat Lodi, the wrestler, not the city in California, in 2:20 with the crossface. Benoit looked great, and challenged Raven who wasn't there due to a stomach illness, after the bout. Flair did an interview about Starrcade, his cage match with Hennig and then talked about Bret Hart and said comparing Bret to Ric Flair would be like comparing John Elway to Jim Kelly, which got a big pop being where they were. He never acknowledged his ankle injury and when walking to the interview, didn't show any signs of a limp. Hart's first major arena match will be 131 in Boston against Flair. Randy Savage went to a no decision with Hugh Morris. Savage was delivering one big elbow after another and refusing to pin him when the lights again went out, and when they came back on, both Savage and Morris were laid out and Savage had a Sting mask on his face. Before this match started, Savage got into it with Jim Kelly and Bruce Smith who were at ringside. Kelly and Smith threw the lamest forearm shots in history at Savage and Smith was laughing while he was supposedly involved in the confrontation. Part of the gate went to a charity fund Kelly is heavily involved in. Bischoff and Rick Rude came out and made idiots out of the announcing team threatening them if the lights went out again during the rest of the show. The way the announcers sold the deal made them look like monkeys. Disco Inferno used the Chartbuster, Stone Cold Stunner, to win the TV title from Perry Saturn in 4:29. It was Saturn's best work since coming to the company, but Disco's offense really lacked believability and he looked bad again. Marcus Bagwell beat Lex Luger via countout in 5:20 when Luger was fighting outside the ring with Scott Norton. Awful. Finally Diamond Dallas Page beat Scott Hall via DQ in 7:57. Crowd was dead until the finish, and when Page hit the Diamond Cutter, isn't this sounding familiar? The whole crowd turned to the back for the run-in. Which is exactly what happened. Page got to use the cutter on NWO whipping Boy Vincent, but Hall got to use the edge to lay out Page. A Sting mannequin sped down from the ceiling through the ring again. When they went to beat up the doll again, it was a real-life human they dragged to the ropes that pretended to be the doll. As Hogan made fun of the dummy unmasked, revealing real Sting and, unable to unhook himself while beating up the NWO which looked ridiculous. He dropped a few of the guys while Hogan wouldn't get in the ring. Weekend ratings for the week of November 29th through the 30th were main event at 1.1, Saturday night at 2.1 and Pro at 1.3. For the weekend of December 6th through 7, main event did a 1.2 and Saturday night at 2.3 and Pro was preempted. Rick Martel is scheduled to debut in January. Eric Bischoff and Sonny Wanu were in Japan this past week, although there was almost no media attention in Japan to their visit. Roddy Piper will be returning in the next few weeks. There has been a lot of talk of Ric Flair turning heel and being managed by Deborah McMichael and do his 80s gimmick on the WCW show. Problem is, nobody wants to boo Flair these days no matter what he does. They really didn't then, but even less now. On the Internet Insider show, Gene Okerlund apologized for saying that Brian Pillman died from cocaine but then blamed it on an AP story which of course wasn't the case. Speaking of Pillman, Diamond Dallas Page and Marcus Bagwell's mother put together a show at Pope High School in Marietta, Georgia over the weekend with the proceeds to benefit the Pillman family. Working the show included Page, Raven's group, Bagwell, Steiners, Steven Regal, Wrath, and Mortis. Steve Smith of the Hawks was there as the timekeeper. The blonde-haired member of Raven's group called Lodi was originally going to be called Skank, but Bischoff vetoed the name trying to differentiate his TV with the WWF's. There is some question as to whether or not Bret Hart can use the Hitman name in WCW. Ref Scott Dickinson, who was taken off the road and ordered to lose 25 pounds after Scott Hall picked up his shirt and unveiled his belly on a Nitro, has dropped 18 and should be back at work in early 1998. The Thursday TV show will definitely now be called Thunder after the idea for calling it that was dropped for a few days. Ravens Group, Diamond Dallas Page and Kimberly are doing music video shoots for Century Media Records. Kevin Sullivan will be getting married at the end of the month. At the December 1st Nitro in the Rey Mysterio Jr. vs. Juventud Guerrero match, Rey whiplashed his head against the top ropes and was knocked silly. He began working a knee injury at that point to explain why he was out of it, but the knee injury itself was a work. Bobby Heenan isn't planning on moving to Atlanta until late 1998. Hulk Hogan and George Steinbrenner did a benefit for a kids group during the week, and Hogan told the kids that all the wrestlers were really friends behind the scenes and all like each other, and that the bad guys were all really great guys. Six will be out of action for several more months after neck surgery. Alex Wright returned home to Germany, where he'll be out for a while after an injury described as being somewhat like a brain aneurysm. WCW Pro will no longer air on TBS in 1998 but will continue as the B Show in syndication. The Nick Patrick heel turn was dropped on the TBS show over the weekend, where Patrick was originally taped turning to help Hall beat Trailer. The entire match was re-edited in post-production. A few subtle maneuvers by Patrick, such as patting Hall on the back during the match, were never acknowledged in the commentary. They did a new finish where Trailer won via DQ and in post-production added the sound of a bell to signify the finish when no such sound took place live. Dusty Rhodes, realizing his star in the company has taken a major fall, has been noticeably bitter about it on television the past few weeks. WCW will do a third annual Elio DiPaolo Memorial Night of the Legends show in Buffalo, New York on June 12. Starrcade advance as of December 8 was 14,578 tickets for $495,760. Mega Nitro on December 22 is basically already sold out. Brian Clark Rath suffered a separated shoulder in an auto accident after getting rear-ended on the way home from the Marietta show on December 6 and will be out of action about 6 weeks. WWF. December 8 Raw as Jerry Springer from Portland, Maine drew a sellout 6,510, paying $86,951, which may have been the largest wrestling gate ever in the state of Maine. The show opened with Scott Taylor winning a squash. Mark Henry beat Chris Duffy. Steve Blackman, who looked good but got almost no reaction, beat Scott King. Vader pinned Farouk when Rocky accidentally hit Farouk, and the two argued afterwards. Recon and Sniper DDQ headbangers. Doug Furness and Phil LaFon beat Matt and Barry Hardy. Hardys took their normal good bumps. One of them looked to have gotten hurt on a messed up plancha spot but recovered and worked the rest of the match okay. Undertaker pinned Sultan in a quickie before the live Raw started. McMahon opened the show with the confrontation with Austin. McMahon looked a lot younger and was a great performer in his role throughout the show. LOD vs. Godwins ended when Kane came out and destroyed Hawk with a piledriver that Hawk didn't sell, a crummy-looking choke slam that he did, and a tombstone piledriver which would be about the first piledriver Hawk has ever sold in his life. Billy Gunn and Jesse Jean beat up Hawk after and challenged anyone in the house to a singles match. Jean mic work was great in his new role, but Gunn was just a bump on a log. Dude Love came out and pinned Gunn in 339 with the double arm DDT. Jean clocked him hard with a chair shot and the two destroyed him, ending with Gunn coming off the top onto the belt which was on Dude's head. During the commercial break, Jean and Gunn did an angle for the crowd getting heat with Tony Atlas. Jim Cornette interviewed Takamichi Noku. Jerry Lawler came out and started insulting him. Then a supposed Mexican called El Unico came out and the two attacked Taka, but of course he unmasked and it was Christopher, and they gave Taka 3 pile drivers to leave him laying. They did a segment tease the whole show about the Hart Foundation being dismantled, showing Neidhart being humiliated, Smith losing to Michaels in England and Brett losing to Michaels in Canada, pointing out Michaels beat Brett in his home country with his favorite hold. Interrogator came out repacked as Kurgan and used the Iron Claw on Flash Funk, but was DQ'd afterwards for not releasing the grip. A rose by any other name still stinks when it's the Interrogator. DX did the strip poker deal. During the commercial break, Michaels mooned the crowd. They kept playing while Miguel and Jose beat Skull and 8-Ball in a match where everyone looked bad but Miguel and Jose looked awful. Savio Vega came out and hit Skull with a 2x4 leading to the pin in 440. They kept the strip poker game going until the headbangers came out to be destroyed. They powerbombed Thrasher off the top rope through the card table and Mosh ended up with his head cut up in several spots. Finally Owen Hart showed up, threw a few punches and escaped into the crowd. Jeff Jarrett beat Vader in a match that actually never got started when Goldust came out and flashed Vader, who chased him away for the countout. Mero did his interview on Sal Sincere and had Sable come out wearing a potato sack. She took it off and was in a tiny swimsuit, and Mero freaked out and dragged her to the back and was also counted out in a match that never got started. The show ended with the McMahon/Austin/Maivia angle. Wonder how long it'll take people to figure out that every week when Austin challenges someone to a match that he never actually wrestles the bout. Probably about 5 years. After the show was over, they had the dark match with LOD and Undertaker and Austin over Nation of Domination. Austin, wearing street clothes, never tagged in once during the match. Tapings for next week were held on December 9th in Durham, New Hampshire. Dark match saw Christopher beat Barry Houston. In shotgun tapings, Bangers beat Godwins in a dud match. Kurgan beat Hardy Boys in a handicap, with Hardys again taking good bumps. Furnace and LaFon beat Taylor and Funk with the bottom rope breaking during the match. Vader beat Mero on a countout when Mero walked out because the fans were chanting for Sable. Evidently they didn't like that finish after seeing it for themselves, because both were sent out to do the same match, but this time Vader won via DQ when Goldust and Luna interfered. For Raw, they opened announcing Michaels vs. Undertaker as the Royal Rumble main event. Undertaker did an interview and Kane came out and slapped him a few times, and Undertaker wouldn't hit him back and Kane walked off. Michinoku beat Lawler via DQ when Christopher interfered. Nation of Domination came out and said Austin had 1 hour to give the IC belt back. Austin said he wouldn't. Dude beat Jam, and after the match Jam and Gunn attacked him and left him laying again. Mark Henry beat Brooklyn Brawler. McMahon did an interview and demanded that Owen Hart stop doing run-ins. Hart cut a promo saying how Vince screwed his brother and he was tired of Vince telling everyone what to do, etc. He said he was after Michaels for personal reasons and didn't care about the belt. McMahon said he doesn't want him around unless he's signed for a match and ordered the police to take him out of the building, which they did. Sal Sincere, without the gimmick and now as Tom Brandi, beat Sultan when Sultan and Iron Sheik collided. After the match, Mero gave Brandi a low blow. Nation of Domination did an interview saying the hour was up and demanded the belt. Austin did a remote from a bridge and said he had thrown the belt off the bridge into a river. Blackman beat Estrada in a match where the crowd was dead. It was so bad they sent them out to do another match, which the crowd was dead, but the match was a lot shorter. Main event saw LOD beat Michaels and Triple H via DQ when Chyna interfered. After the match, Gunn and Jam joined DX and destroyed LOD, including shaving Hawk's head. This was the angle to set up LOD's being gone until late January. Dark match main saw Undertaker beat Triple H in a casket match described as slow and boring and without heat. Weekend ratings for October 29th through the 30th saw Livewire at 1.2 and Superstars at 1.5. For December 6th through the 7th, it was Livewire at 1.5 and Superstars at 1.7. Glenn Kulka has a legal problem of some sort that doesn't allow him to cross the border into the United States. Advance for Raw at the Nassau Coliseum on December 29th has already topped $200,000. Ahmed Johnson's return from the auto accident in which he suffered neck and back damage now isn't expected until January. TSN in Canada refused to air the Goldust and Luna interview on the December 1st show. Add another wrinkle to the Hart/MC/Mahon story. On October 21st in Tulsa, Hart asked McMahon if after he left would McMahon bury him the way he did to Savage and Hogan, and McMahon promised he'd never do such a thing. The 1/12th live Raw from Hamilton, Ontario was moved to State College, Pennsylvania, apparently because of fear of what could be the reaction on a live show in Canada. The only house show of the week was December 6th in Providence, Rhode Island, which drew 7,105, paying $133,154. Shamrock's match with D'Lo Brown only went 30 seconds. Main event was scheduled as Undertaker vs. Triple H in a casket match. Taker was a no-show and there was no announcement made about it ahead of time. Michaels got on the mic and claimed he had run Undertaker out of the WWF the same way he did with Brett and challenged anyone in the back to come out. Austin came out of the casket and beat Triple H in a casket match that only lasted 2 minutes. Danny Hotch will be brought in as a special guest at the December 15th show in Little Rock. The readers' pages. Double cross. I think the November 17th issue was the best issue of The Observer ever. It was very obvious that Shawn Michaels was in on it, and the reason was that McMahon has chosen him to lead the WWF for some time to come. Dave Katz. Mount Holly, New Jersey. I've now subscribed to The Observer for 10 years. I'd like to thank you. A weekly part of my life for a decade. It has allowed me to appreciate and understand the world of pro wrestling in such a way that I never would have been able to otherwise. The writing is insightful and piercing, the commentary on target. I've sampled other newsletters and surveyed websites, and I have an opinion why The Observer is the best. It can't be argued that there is no other source of such voluminous amounts of both historical and current information, but what puts The Observer above the rest is your objectivity. You look at wrestling and explain its strange events in a fair, unbiased manner. I believe that your knack for impartiality, putting things into proper context, is what makes your coverage the most reliable and most informative. Other newsletter writers are really just glorified op-ed types who thinly veil their opinions while trying to come across as news hounds. You are a reporter, and an exceptional one at that. As far as the Bret Hart thing goes, I just don't feel sorry for Hart. It seems to me he dug his own grave. Vince McMahon is the one who takes the risks. If the WWF goes out of business, McMahon goes down and Hart can work elsewhere. I think Hart has a lot of nerve to complain considering how he handled dropping the title to Michaels a few years back. Taking off and waiting to see Titan flop with Michaels on top was like the little kid taking his ball and going home. I understand that he had reasonable creative control over his last 30 days, but the key word is reasonable. That word was to prevent him from doing 30 straight nights of 2-minute squash matches to every jobber in the company during his last month. I don't think it can be construed as meaning he gets to cherry-pick who he drops the title to. That seems unreasonable. The title means so much to him, and I feel sorry for the fact that he forgets this business is a work. As for Shawn Michaels, there is no more talented wrestler in the United States today. The guy is amazing. It's a shame so many people dislike his character on such a personal level that they don't realize he's both a tremendous face and heel. He's another Ric Flair to me. I don't care what he is supposed to be, I'm cheering him. While it's in vogue to criticize him, I think people should ask themselves that if they were in his shoes last year when Hart got a 20-year contract, if it would have been upset. There's another reason I think it's unfair to criticize McMahon on this account and to say that the wrestlers can't trust those in charge. Let's not forget all the wrestlers who refuse to do jobs or talk bookers out of decisions. I seem to remember Honky Tonk Man refusing to drop the IC title on an NBC special. In recent times we've seen Kevin Nash and Scott Hall talk the powers that be out of dropping the tag team titles. What about the Arn Anderson spoof? That angle should have ended with the Horseman running in, but again the wrestlers talked their way out of an angle they didn't want to do. Don't get me wrong. If you can wield the power, do it. Lord knows I've been guilty for talking weak bosses out of making me do stuff I didn't want to do. But I think it is unfortunate this type of stuff goes on throughout the business, and yet Shawn Michaels is the Antichrist. I think we need to realize that pro wrestling is entertainment, and Shawn Michaels is routinely in fantastic matches. He's the only wrestler today whose pay-per-view matches are can't misses. Nobody delivers like him. I've got to say I'm truly frustrated with WCW. The other week on Nitro during a match, and I forget the match but it had talented wrestlers being wasted, Tony Schiavone said something to the effect of, as I was saying before, I was interrupted by the action in the ring. I couldn't believe it. All I want them to do is talk about the matches. The Mexicans do things that should be popping the crowds at pay-per-view shows big time, but to the fans at home they are all nothing because the announcers treat them like nothing. I remember when Rey Mysterio Jr. versus Juventud Guerrera was considered a treat. Now it's guaranteed to be 3.5 minutes and ignored. WCW has all the pieces to take this to the next level, but they are blowing it. Their pay-per-view shows should be loaded from top to bottom. Instead, we get a couple of great matches and tons of discussion during those matches about the NWO. As far as the awards, Match of the Year is a toss-up between Michaels vs. Undertaker in the cage and Mitsuharu Misawa vs. Toshiaki Kawada on June 6th. Both were classics. Dan Cirquitella. Reno, Nevada. The departure of Bret Hart will not be a mortal blow to the WWF. Many young aspiring wrestlers cutting their teeth in independent promotions will compare the glut of aging name talent in WCW to the dwindling amount of name talent in WWF and decide that the career opportunities might be greater in the WWF. People should be aware that Rocky Maivia, in his rookie year, became the Intercontinental Champion. In WCW, he'd be lucky to be allowed to drive the NWO limo. Another source of talent for WWF could be WCW undercard wrestlers. Chris Benoit, Ray Traylor and High Voltage might realize their paths to the top may be blocked for a long time. They may also be aware that despite Eric Bischoff's marketing genius, Vince McMahon remains the undisputed creative genius in pro wrestling, able to turn a seemingly lame character like Goldust into a cult figure. Consequently, at the expiration of their WCW contracts, they might look northward and decide that Stamford, Connecticut isn't such an overpriced hellhole after all. The key now is how McMahon uses his remaining superstars. He has no excuse not to give a major push to Vader and Farouk. He must also bring back Owen Hart to be pushed into an angle with Shawn Michaels to get revenge for running Bret out of the WWF. When Hart wins the WWF title, he could claim to be the real excellence of execution and finally break out of Bret's shadow once and for all. A world title run for Owen Hart would enable the WWF to salvage some of its fan base in Canada. Carl Lurbs. Anchorage, Alaska. Even though we were in the front row to witness the fiasco in Montreal, your coverage of that weekend made us feel that we were even closer than the front row. The following 3 weeks of The Observer were a masterpiece of journalism, and not just wrestling journalism. Your prose will be the foundation for the history of the wrestling business for years to come, and your work makes us proud to be wrestling fans. Chris and Jan Kazmierzak. Columbus, Ohio. McMahon really outdid himself this year. The live interview with Melanie Pillman was the worst thing of the year. As for Bret Hart, Bret should have known better. The 2 hours of Raw last week only had 4 matches. Maybe it got ratings, but whatever happened to wrestling? The weekly soap opera with DX is already old. Anthony Parrillo. Providence, Rhode Island. I attended the Survivor Series on November 9th, and the feeling among the fans leaving the building that night was very much anti-WWF and pro-WCW. My take on the situation is as follows. The wrestling business consists of wrestlers and promoters. Wrestlers are paid to do a job, which is to perform in the ring. Promoters are there to make sure they can benefit financially from the wrestles. As far as I'm concerned, Bret Hart was paid $1.5 million per year to wrestle. It was Vince McMahon's job to decide who wins and who loses. I'm in no way defending what McMahon did, because it was reprehensible, but this situation never would have happened if Hart would have put his ego on the back burner and did his job. The business of not wanting to lose in Canada was a lame excuse. British Bulldog put over Shawn Michaels in his home country. Hulk Hogan dropped the WWF title 3 times in his home country, so why couldn't Bret have dropped the title in Montreal? When Kevin Nash and Scott Hall gave notice, they spent their final 2 months doing jobs, which is the way this business has functioned for many years. Why should Bret Hart be any different? Unfortunately, Bret Hart lives in his cartoon character world where he thinks that he's Superman who rides off into the sunset as the world's greatest hero. He thinks he represents everything that is good about the business, which isn't much. But his actions over the last several months contradict his beliefs. This role model attacked Shawn Michaels in the locker room, which I'm sure is something he's proud to tell his children, and then attacked a 52-year-old man, which can't be justified based on what happened earlier that night. He's talked negatively about Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair, the latter of whom has to be the most respected wrestler in the business today. What does this say about this legend that we all think he is? Bret Hart should have realized that once you give notice, you job out. It just so happens some of those matches would be in Canada. Vince's job is to make his company look better than WCW. He would look of Vince's new top wrestler, Michaels, can't beat a WCW wrestler, Hart. It doesn't make any business sense. As far as I'm concerned, Bret asked for this situation to happen and got what he deserved. Gino Pompa. Montreal, Quebec. Kudos for your continued excellent journalism and recent landmark editions concerning the death of Brian Pillman and the fascinating Vince McMahon-Bret Hart double-cross. Sad to say, but you do your most incredible work doing obits like those of Andre the Giant, the Von Erichs, Ray Stevens and Pillman, to name just a few that I've given to colleagues in the teaching profession. Students of mine at our high school who are into wrestling often bring in printouts from computer sites with tidbits of information, and are then blown away by the depth of your reporting. As a fan of 27 years who attended many WWF television tapings at the Hamburg Fieldhouse years ago, I've got some observations and questions. Why are people so surprised that Vince McMahon did what he did to Bret Hart? From his point of view, which is the only point of view anyone usually looks at things while under pressure, he was simply protecting himself, and in his business interests. He is the owner and as such is the one who is assuming the financial risks of all the decisions he makes. As you documented, he established a precedent with Wendy Richter. Given what Medusa did to him, he wasn't about to take any chances with his most prestigious belt, which I believe he's already badly damaged over the last year with changing it so frequently. McMahon tried to couch it as best he could on the interview using terms like the time-honored traditions of the business, but basically revealed to the entire world that Hart wouldn't do the job. Given the history between Hart and Shawn Michaels, I don't blame Hart for feeling that way, but given that McMahon put Hart over other wrestlers who probably weren't thrilled about putting him over, and made Hart what he is today in the business, while acknowledging fully Hart's skills and abilities, the bottom line is that McMahon is the owner and the buck has to stop there. In today's society, players went to tell coaches how to coach. In Hollywood, as soon as stars get big enough, they want to direct their own movies, and employees always have an opinion on how the boss should run things. The inmates have been running the asylum in the WWF for quite a while, and the head nut decided to try and regain control. Creative input from the employee should always be welcome and encouraged, but it's like the high school kid who finally works up the nerve to ask the gorgeous girl of his dreams to the prom. He has to be prepared to handle the rejection as well as the answer for which he hopes.
McMahon's prerogative is to do things his way because he has to live with the results.
Bill Gilger, Shamokin, Pennsylvania. Response from Dave Meltzer.
There's a point being missed here that the WWF is spoofing on its own television.
It's called a contract, a supposed legal agreement between Hart and McMahon.
It was McMahon who was going back and forth in his mind on wanting to breach it, not Hart.
The terms of the contract make any traditional boss/employee argument in this specific case not applicable because the situation regarding the final 30 days, a period which began on November 1st, specifically gave Hart reasonable control of his destiny. That covered the suggestion for the match in Detroit, which was never booked in the first place. That covered the match in Toronto. Whether you agree with Hart's feelings on not wanting to lose in Canada and not wanting to ruin the drama of the match in Montreal by going in as the challenger, he was within his contractual rights to veto the losses.
McMahon couldn't order Hart to do anything against his wishes in the final 30 days of his tenure in the WWF because of an agreement both agreed to.
If the agreement was stupid, that's McMahon's fault for agreeing to it, not Hart's fault for asking McMahon to live up to it.
If a wrestler signs a 5-year deal with McMahon at $250,000 per year, then suddenly becomes the hottest thing in the business and can make more money in WCW, or just becomes unhappy and wants to work in WCW, they don't have that power because they signed away that power when accepting the offer McMahon made to them. Just as if the shoe is on the other foot, if McMahon signs a wrestler like Mark Henry to a 10-year deal at $250,000 per year and the wrestler flops, he can't just stop paying him because in hindsight he made a bad deal.
Contracts aren't always fair. In fact, very few things in life are fair. What is fair about Henry having the same contractual deal as, perhaps, Mick Foley? But that is missing the point. It is the supposed legal requirement to live up to them. When McMahon told Hart he wasn't going to live up to his agreement, it wasn't Hart's fault for McMahon putting McMahon in a bad position. If Hart was being paid more than he was worth, and if you look at the situation from a business standpoint, he wasn't, although in comparison with what Undertaker and Austin were earning, he was. But in comparison to what Henry is earning, everyone in the company is underpaid. It was McMahon's fault for agreeing to pay it, not Hart's fault for accepting the big weekly check. By double-crossing him, he was not only breaching the trust of his wrestlers and establishing for all eternity what the word of Vince McMahon means under pressure, but he was yet again violating an agreed-upon deal, just as Hart was violating what people in a civil environment should do by punching him afterwards. The whole saving the belt argument is moot. Hart had agreed to drop it many different times to anyone asked, including, at the end, to Michaels. If Hart isn't telling the truth about being willing to drop the title the next weekend, and as mentioned documentation and story consistency appears to back up his story on this regard, then that was an unreasonable request. However, in the dressing room in Montreal 3 hours before showtime, McMahon suggested changing an agreed-upon scenario that Bischoff had to agree to. At that point, when Hart suggested not losing the title and doing the interview the next night, McMahon shook his hand and agreed to that new scenario.
If McMahon had a problem with that new scenario, and I agree that he should not have shaken his hand and agreed to it and then began plotting the double cross. There are many aspects of this story in which Hart's viewpoint can be argued about for all eternity, and the punch is certainly one of them.
But none are a defense of any of the actions of McMahon. The agreed-upon best route for business going into Montreal was for Hart to lose the belt on December 7th in the four-way, so the lame duck argument wasn't an issue at that point in the agreed-upon scenario. It only became an issue after the double cross.
If McMahon found the timing bad, which it was due to a situation he largely created for himself by Hart's WCW contract being effective on December 1st, but that also could have been taken care of by drawing up a document with the planned scenario and getting Hart, McMahon and Bischoff all to sign it, and then there would be no problem with him losing the title on December 7th and doing the interview on December 8th.
But even if Bischoff wouldn't sign a document to agree to what he verbally agreed to, then Hart losing it in Boston on November 29th, during a time period where he still worked for McMahon and not Bischoff, would have worked out okay. Losing it at the Garden on November 15th was possible as well, or on TV from Fayetteville. The idea that their world champion was leaving to be kept under wraps for protection of the belt is negated by the fact Titan told its wrestlers at the tapings on November 3rd that Hart had given notice and was leaving. The idea that they had to get the belt off Hart before the announcement on Nitro on November 10th is total BS, because if that was the case for killing the belt in business, which anyone with any logic realizes by now isn't the case, then the buy rate for the pay-per-view in Canada would have been killed, since that was the exact scenario in that country. Some WWF wrestlers went to the hotel where the WCW wrestlers were staying that night. Both shows were being taped in eastern Pennsylvania, and told them which was the first anyone in WCW, with the exception of maybe 3 or 4 front office people and 1 announcer, knew. In other words, it was the WWF, not WCW, that was responsible for the word leaking out and making Hart a lame duck before the Montreal match to begin with. Even if they hadn't, you can't expect word of a story of that magnitude to not become common knowledge within 24 hours. Not that it wouldn't have been had they not told the wrestlers, because that news was going to be out on November 4th no matter what Titan would have told its wrestlers. And if the sanctity of the belt was so important, why did McMahon not consider that in the first place when he told Hart in Madison Square Garden outright that he was going to breach his contract at a time when Hart held the title? Did he decide to put 2 titles on Michaels when he had previously not dropped the last several belts he'd been given? And did he change the IC belt this past week in the manner in which he did? As one WWF headliner mentioned to me in the aftermath, a point that many readers have brought up as well, at that specific point, he felt Hart should have let McMahon breach the deal, and once he did so, just gone home, never dropped the title, and filed suit. He had a contract, so McMahon was going to have to pay him for the next 19 years, or if he got a summary judgment, and a major lump sum, plus his court costs, unless the company went bankrupt. At the same time, McMahon would have really destroyed his title, and Hart would have had no reason to do the job since the contract had been breached first. And after McMahon breached him and they went to court, Hart still could have gone to WCW for the same money without ever losing the title, although not appearing on their television with McMahon's belt, and from a legal standpoint he at that point wouldn't have been wrong to do so. McMahon counted on, correctly as it was, Hart's friendship and professionalism, and his own world-class powers of personal persuasion to not do that. Do you think Hart losing the title in Montreal and having Michaels versus Shamrock on December 7th was better for business than the original plan? It was McMahon, after agreeing to the month-long scenario of Hart finishing up and using the fact he was leaving to build ratings, house shows and the final pay-per-view, who tried to change the terms of December 7th literally 3 hours before the pay-per-view show started, which is where the communication breakdown problems all started. The fact there was a creative control agreement destroys all the arguments defending McMahon's position that the promoter has the ultimate authority. I agree that under normal circumstances the promoter should have the ultimate authority because he's the one who pays the checks and takes the financial risks and all that. Even if that creative control agreement wasn't there between the two of them, once McMahon shook his hand in the dressing room at 4 p.m. and agreed to Hart's scenario, doing the double cross still ruined whatever was left of his credibility in the business. And even if he didn't shake his hand, or if you argue that even when agreeing to something he has the right to double-cross using the defense that he's the owner and puts up the money and should have the final say, may be the case with every other wrestler in the company in every other scenario. But it doesn't apply in this specific case. McMahon gave that power to Hart over his last 30 days, a concession that he may have regretted, but it was part of the deal he made. Whether Hart's decision to want to delay losing the title at that point was the best thing for McMahon's business, it actually was, but again, that's besides the point, or if by making that decision he showed he was a mark for being a Canadian hero, or that he takes things too seriously, or however anyone wants to portray him for his actions, is all irrelevant to the real issues in this case. If Hart had refused to drop the title to anyone at all, that would be unreasonable. Wanting to delay the switch for 5 or 6 days isn't even close to unreasonable. If the idea that Hart had to lose the title before word got out was so important, why was it Titan that told its wrestlers at the tapings on November 3rd that Hart was leaving? The creative control agreement was just another deal he made that when the pressure was on he wouldn't live up to. And the whole Medusa situation fear was paranoid delusions and is hardly one to feel sorry for McMahon for. He had already fired her 5 days before she showed up in WCW. Sorry, but loyalty to an employer ends when the employer makes the decision to fire you. And one can make the argument in Hart's case that loyalty to an employer should end the minute the employer tells you he is going to breach your contract. Hart learned a valuable lesson about wrestling in that if someone breaks their word to you on one occasion, you can't take them at their word at any occasion in the future. At that point, Hart had to use whatever power McMahon gave him to protect himself on the way out,
because the time-honored traditions of the business are for the promoter in the last 30 days to do everything in his power to screw the person leaving, whether it be burying him on finishes at the arenas and his persona on television,
but also on his final paychecks.
To McMahon's credit, that latter time-honored tradition of the business is one that he doesn't adhere to. The WWF has shown by its television since Hart left that they are not an organization of enough class to not childishly take that time-honored tradition to any less extreme aside from the paycheck aspect than all the other promoters of the past in the same position, and in this case,
were a lot worse than 99% of them in the same situation. Although Hart was, in hindsight, either naive in the ring to allow himself to be put in that hold or naive to believe in the value of Hebner's word and friendship, he was not naive enough regarding those time-honored traditions to not protect himself over those last 30 days. I don't feel sorry for Bret Hart the person. There are a lot worse futures in this world, and with the exception of Hulk Hogan, maybe none better financially in his profession, than having a multi-million-dollar deal working 125 to 140 dates per year. I do feel sorry for Owen and Bulldog, because McMahon has put them in a terrible position and neither did anything to deserve it, and to Jim Neidhart, who simply because of who he's married to, became the whipping boy of a bitter company trying to use him to get back at Bret for his post-match actions.
And I do feel sorry for Bret Hart the professional wrestler, because he did take his job and his character very seriously, and it was important to him to leave after more than 13 years on a high note, and leave not bitter toward the company that made him famous and someday return for the Hall of Fame banquet,
and that all was taken away from him. ECW. I attended the ECW pay-per-view here in Pittsburgh and I really enjoyed it as a live event. I haven't seen the tape yet. It was a lot better than I expected it to be. I probably wouldn't have bothered with it if it wasn't a local show, since none of the matches seemed that interesting.
But Paul Heyman's booking was superb this time out and really hit a lot of the weaknesses of some of the wrestlers.
I also have to say how impressed I was with the local promotion. Shane Douglas worked his ass off, doing local appearances and commercials. The day before the event, the ECW wrestlers were everywhere, appearing at local clubs, malls, etc. I think this was a key in drawing such a good house. Pittsburgh is a city where people only turn out for big league events, so the promotion really got the show over locally as a must-see live show. I'm still working on my year-end ballot. The promotion that really stood out for me this year was All Japan.
The main events are always spectacular, and the addition of Hiroshi Hase made them that much better.
I even liked seeing Hayabusa, who I always thought was a joke before, and Jinsei Shinzaki, who I thought the same about, now that they are working part-time. If Baba could find just one more new guy to mix in with Mitsuharu Misawa, Toshiaki Kawada, Kenta Kobashi, Jun Akiyama, Akira Tao and Hase, it would be perfect. What he needs is a new top American star since Johnny Ace, Stan Hansen, Steve Williams and Gary Albright can't keep up anymore.
Except who is there out there of the level of Baba's top guys?
Andrew Stowell. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Wrestling Observer Newsletter. P.O. Box 1228, Campbell, California 95009-1228. December 15, 1997.